Father Marco Benedetti had served at St. Peter's Basilica for over 2 decades when he first heard the whispers. It was during the winter of 2019, late on a Tuesday evening when the last tourists had departed and the massive cathedral settled into its ancient silence. As the newly appointed keeper of the confessionals, Marco was responsible for ensuring each booth was properly maintained and blessed. The task usually took him 30 minutes, moving methodically through the ornate wooden structures that had heard countless secrets over the centuries. But on this particular night, as he approached Confessional 7, the oldest of them all, dating back to the 16th century, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Whispers. Not one voice, but dozens, overlapping in a cacophony of urgent murmurs that seemed to emanate from within the confessional itself. Marco paused, his hand trembling as he reached for the heavy wooden door. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. He could make out fragments in Latin, Italian, French, and languages he couldn't identify. They spoke of sins so dark that even seasoned priests would recoil, murders committed in the name of faith, betrayals that shattered families, blasphemies that would make angels weep. "Forgive me, Father, for I have killed in your name. The children, I couldn't save the children. The plague was my doing. I poisoned the wells." Marco's breath came in short gasps as he realized what he was hearing. The confessions of the damned, trapped souls who had poured their darkest secrets into this sacred space, but had never received absolution. Their sins had festered here for centuries, creating a spiritual wound that refused to heal. Against his better judgment, Marco pulled open the confessional door. The whispers ceased instantly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt suffocating. The small space inside was empty, but the air was thick with the scent of decay and something else, sulfur. On the kneeler where countless penitents had sought forgiveness, fresh scratches marred the ancient wood. As Marco leaned closer to examine them, he saw they formed words in medieval Latin: "Nolla redemptio," no redemption. The temperature in the confessional plummeted. Marco's breath formed clouds in the suddenly frigid air, and frost began to form on the wooden walls. Then, from the darkness beyond the confessional screen, came a voice that seemed to crawl up from the depths of hell itself. "Will you hear my confession, Father?" Marco stumbled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the ornate screen, he could see nothing but impenetrable blackness, a darkness so complete it seemed to devour the faint light from the basilica's distant chandeliers. "I have waited so long," the voice continued, each word dripping with malevolent hunger. "Centuries of silence, but you have opened the door. You have given me voice." Marco wanted to run, every instinct screaming at him to flee, but his feet felt rooted to the marble floor. The voice began to speak, and with each word, images flashed in Marco's mind. Visions of torture chambers beneath the Vatican, of secret trials and executions, of innocents buried alive in the foundation stones of the very basilica where he stood. "Do you see, Father? Do you see what your precious church has built upon? The blood of martyrs, yes, but also the blood of the innocent. We are the forgotten ones, the casualties of faith. And now we hunger for justice." The whispers returned, growing in volume until they became a roar of anguish and rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of St. Peter's. Marco covered his ears, but the sound came from within his own skull, burrowing into his consciousness like parasites. When dawn broke over Vatican City, the security guards found Father Marco kneeling before Confessional 7. His hair turned completely white overnight. He was muttering in languages they didn't recognize, his eyes wide and unseeing. When they touched his shoulder, he screamed a sound so filled with terror that several guards crossed themselves and whispered prayers. Marco was quietly transferred to a monastery in the mountains, officially suffering from exhaustion and stress. But the few who visited him reported that he spent his days writing obsessively, filling page after page with confessions that weren't his own sins from centuries past, detailed accounts of atrocities that no living person should know. The monastery's abbot eventually had the writings destroyed, claiming they were too dangerous to exist. But he kept one page, locked in his personal safe. On it, written in Marco's hand but in medieval script, was a single line repeated hundreds of times. They are waiting in the confessional. They are waiting for you to listen. Confessional 7 was sealed shortly after the incident, its entrance bricked over and hidden behind a tapestry. But maintenance workers report that on certain nights, when the wind is still and the basilica is empty, you can still hear the whispers, countless voices pleading for forgiveness that will never come, their sins too heavy for any earthly absolution. And sometimes, they say, if you press your ear to the brick wall where the confessional once stood, you can hear Father Marco's voice among them, adding his own confession to the eternal chorus of the damned. Sister Catherine O'Sullivan had always possessed what the Church diplomatically called spiritual sensitivity. Growing up in rural Ireland, she had seen things others couldn't, shadows where no shadows should be, heard voices in empty rooms, felt the presence of those long departed. Rather than viewing it as a curse, Catherine embraced her gift as a calling, joining the Missionary Sisters of Charity, and eventually earning a prestigious assignment to Vatican City as a restoration specialist. Her expertise in medieval manuscripts made her invaluable to the Vatican archives, and for 3 years, she worked diligently in the underground chambers beneath the Apostolic Palace, cataloging and preserving documents that chronicled 2 millennia of church history. It was rewarding work, she thought, until the night she discovered that some history refuses to stay buried. It was October 31st, 2020, All Hallows Eve. Though such designations mattered little in the timeless halls of the Vatican, Catherine had been working late, poring over a collection of papal correspondence from the 14th century, when she realized she had left her reading glasses in the Sistine Chapel earlier that day. She had been part of a small team documenting the latest restoration work on Michelangelo's frescoes, and she distinctly remembered placing the glasses on a ledge near the altar. The chapel should have been empty at that hour, sealed and guarded as it always was when not in official use. But Catherine had the necessary clearances, and the Swiss guards knew her well enough to grant access without question. She made her way through the darkened corridors, her footsteps echoing in the vast silence. As she approached the chapel's entrance, she noticed something odd. A faint glow emanated from beneath the heavy wooden doors, not the harsh fluorescent light used for restoration work, but the warm, flickering illumination of candlelight. She paused, listening intently, and heard the unmistakable sound of Gregorian chanting drifting from within. Catherine frowned. No mass was scheduled for that evening, and certainly not at such a late hour. Perhaps a cardinal had arranged a private ceremony? Such things were not uncommon, though she should have been notified if restoration materials needed to be moved. She pressed her ear to the door. The chanting was clearer now. Multiple voices joined in perfect harmony, singing the Latin Mass. But there was something wrong with it. The words were familiar, but the melody was subtly different, older somehow, as if it were being sung in a style that predated modern liturgical music by centuries. Curiosity overcoming caution, Catherine slowly pushed open the door and peered inside. The Sistine Chapel was filled with people. Dozens of figures knelt in the pews, their heads bowed in prayer. Candles flickered along the walls, and altar, casting dancing shadows across Michelangelo's masterpiece. At the altar stood a priest in elaborate vestments, his back to the congregation as he performed the sacred ritual. Catherine's first thought was relief. It was simply a private mass, probably for visiting clergy or dignitaries. She would quietly retrieve her glasses and leave without disturbing the ceremony. But as she stepped inside, something made her stop. The congregation was perfectly still, not just quiet or reverent, but motionless in a way that human beings simply couldn't achieve. No one coughed, shifted position, or even seemed to breathe. They knelt like statues, their forms somehow indistinct in the candlelight. The priest at the altar continued the Mass, his voice echoing in the chapel with unnatural resonance. Catherine found herself drawn forward, her feet moving of their own accord, As she drew closer to the nearest pew, she could see the figure more clearly, her breath caught in her throat. The man, if it was a man, wore the robes of a medieval cardinal, the fabric rich and ornate, but clearly ancient. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and when Catherine looked closer, she realized she could see the faint outline of the pew through his body. His lips moved in silent prayer, but his eyes were gone, replaced by dark, hollow sockets that seemed to absorb the candlelight. With growing horror, Catherine looked around the chapel. Every figure in the congregation bore the same characteristics: ornate robes from different historical periods, translucent flesh, and those terrible empty eye sockets. Cardinals, bishops, and papal officials from across the centuries all gathered for this midnight mass that should not exist. The priest at the altar turned to face the congregation, and Catherine had to bite down on her knuckle to keep from screaming. His face was a ruin of decayed flesh, his jaw hanging at an impossible angle. The elaborate mitre on his head bore symbols she didn't recognize, not Christian iconography, but something far older and darker. When he spoke, his voice filled the chapel like thunder. Et in saecula saeculorum, and for ages of ages. The congregation responded as one, their voices a hollow whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Amen. Catherine realized with mounting terror that she was witnessing some unholy parody of the Mass, a ritual performed by the souls of corrupt clergy who had damned themselves through their earthly actions. They were trapped here, she understood, forced to perform this blasphemous ceremony for eternity, their sins binding them to the very place where they had once wielded holy authority. The priest's hollow gaze fell upon Catherine, and she saw recognition in those empty sockets. His ruined mouth curved into what might have been a smile. "Welcome, sister," he said, his voice now speaking directly into her mind. "Will you join our congregation? We have been waiting so long for fresh blood to sanctify our eternal Mass." The ghostly figures in the pews turned toward her in unison, their eyeless faces somehow conveying a terrible hunger. Catherine saw cardinals who had sold church offices for gold, bishops who had murdered their way to power, and papal officials who had committed unspeakable acts in the name of religious authority. All of them reached out toward her with translucent hands, their mouths moving in silent invitation. Catherine ran. She burst through the chapel doors and fled through the corridors, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Behind her, she could hear the chanting growing louder, more insistent, as if the damned clergy were calling her back to join their unholy congregation. She didn't stop running until she reached her quarters, where she barricaded the door and spent the rest of the night in prayer. When dawn broke, she crept back to the Sistine Chapel, expecting to find evidence of the previous night's horror. The chapel was empty and clean, exactly as it should be. Her reading glasses sat on the ledge where she had left them, untouched. There was no trace of candles, no lingering scent of incense, no sign that dozens of spirits had gathered there for their blasphemous ritual. But when Catherine looked up at Michelangelo's Last Judgment fresco behind the altar, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. One of the figures in hell, a damned soul being dragged down into the abyss, bore the unmistakable features of the priest she had seen conducting the midnight mass. Catherine requested a transfer the next day, citing personal reasons. She returned to Ireland and took vows of silence, never speaking of what she had witnessed in the Sistine Chapel. But those who knew her said she was never the same, that she would wake screaming in the night, and that on certain evenings, particularly around All Hallows' Eve, she could be heard whispering Latin prayers with desperate urgency. Years later, when Catherine was found dead in her cell at the convent, apparently having died peacefully in her sleep, the other sisters reported a strange detail. Her body was discovered kneeling in prayer, but her eyes had been carefully covered with blessed cloth, as if she had been trying to prevent herself from seeing something terrible. In her personal effects, they found a single note written in her shaking handwriting. They still gather for Mass, every night at midnight, and someday they will expect all of us to join them. The Vatican quietly investigated Catherine's claims, but officially concluded that she had suffered a nervous breakdown brought on by overwork and isolation. However, security protocols for the Sistine Chapel were discreetly enhanced, and guards were instructed to report any unusual lights or sounds, particularly around midnight. To this day, those reports continue to come in with disturbing regularity. Dr. Alessandro Rossi had dedicated his life to uncovering the Vatican's most closely guarded secrets. As the chief archivist of the Vatican Secret Archive, Snow, officially called the Vatican Apostolic Archives, had access to documents and records that most scholars could only dream of examining. Papal correspondence, records of heresy trials, accounts of miracles and exorcisms, diplomatic communications spanning centuries. All of this fell under Alessandro's purview. But it was what lay beneath the official archives that would ultimately drive him to madness. Alessandro had always suspected that the Vatican's documented history represented only the tip of the iceberg. Too many records had gaps, too many important events were glossed over or missing entirely. After 20 years of meticulous work, he had developed a theory. There was another archive, a deeper one, containing the documents too dangerous or damning for official preservation. His opportunity to prove this theory came in the spring of 2021, during renovation work on the archive's foundation. Workers had discovered a sealed chamber behind a wall that had been bricked up sometime in the 16th century. The chamber was not on any architectural plans, and its existence had been completely forgotten by institutional memory. As chief archivist, Alessandro was given the honor of being the first to enter the hidden chamber. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his brief remaining life. The chamber was vast, far larger than the architectural drawings suggested should be possible. The walls were lined with shelves that stretched up into darkness, and those shelves were filled with documents, scrolls, and books that seemed to pulse with their own malevolent energy. The air was thick with the scent of old parchment, and something else, something organic and disturbing. At the center of the chamber stood an ornate wooden desk, its surface covered with papers written in what appeared to be fresh blood. A single candle burned beside the papers, though Alessandro couldn't see how it had remained lit for centuries in this sealed space. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, Alessandro began to read the documents on the desk. What he found made his scholarly excitement quickly turn to horror. These were records of the Vatican's darkest secrets, detailed accounts of mass murders committed by church authorities, documentation of systematic torture and execution of innocent people branded as heretics, records of child sacrifice rituals performed by corrupted clergy. But these weren't simply historical documents. They were written in multiple hands across different time periods, as if the chamber itself had been continuously maintained by unseen scribes who recorded every dark deed performed in the church's name. Alessandro picked up one of the blood-stained papers. It was dated just 3 months prior and described the mysterious death of a Vatican librarian who had apparently discovered something he shouldn't have. The man had been found in his apartment, apparently having torn out his own eyes while writing the word veritas over and over on the walls in his own blood. Truth, Alessandro whispered, recognizing the Latin word. As if summoned by his voice, a figure materialized from the shadows between the shelves. It was a man in clerical robes, but his face was a horror beyond description. Flesh hung in tatters from his skull, revealing bone and sinew beneath. Where his eyes should have been, there were only dark holes that seemed to contain swirling galaxies of stars. "Welcome, Alessandro," the figure said, its voice like the whisper of dry leaves. "I have been waiting so long for someone to read the true history." "Who are you?" Alessandro managed to ask, though his voice came out as barely a croak. "I am the keeper of this archive," the figure replied. "I was once like you, a seeker of truth, a scholar who believed that knowledge was sacred regardless of how terrible it might be. But I learned too much, and now I am bound to this place, forced to record every sin, every atrocity, every betrayal committed by those who claim to serve the divine." The keeper gestured toward the endless shelves. "Every document here represents a life destroyed by the church's hunger for power. Every scroll contains the testimony of someone who was silenced to protect the institution. Every book chronicles the corruption of those who claim to speak for God. Alessandro found himself drawn deeper into the archive, compelled by a mixture of scholarly curiosity and growing dread. The documents he found were horrifying in their detailed records of the Papal Inquisition that made the official accounts seem like children's stories. Documentation of treasure stolen from conquered peoples and hidden in Vatican vaults, detailed plans for assassinations and political manipulations that spanned continents. But the worst discoveries were the personal accounts letters from priests confessing to crimes that would make hardened criminals recoil, detailed instructions for torture techniques used on prisoners, and most disturbing of all, records of rituals that seemed to invert everything the Church claimed to represent. "Why show me this?" Alessandro asked the keeper. "Why preserve these horrors?" "Because truth demands witness," the keeper replied. "Someone must know. Someone must remember. The official history is built on lies and covered in the blood of innocents. This archive is the only place where their voices can still be heard." Alessandro spent hours in the chamber, each document revealing new depths of corruption and evil, but gradually he became aware that something was changing. The papers he had been reading were beginning to include his own name, describing his discovery of the archive, his horror at what he found, and most disturbingly, what he would do next. "You cannot leave," the keeper informed him when Alessandro tried to head toward the chamber's entrance. "Not with this knowledge. The archive demands a new keeper, someone to continue the work of recording truth. Your predecessor served for 3 centuries before his flesh finally gave out entirely. You are much younger, you should last longer." Alessandro looked around the chamber with new understanding. The shadows between the shelves weren't empty, they were filled with the ghostly forms of previous keepers. Scholars and clerics who had discovered the archive over the centuries and been trapped here to serve its dark purpose. "No," Alessandro said, backing toward the entrance. "I won't become part of this. I won't be trapped here." But as he reached for the door, it slammed shut with thunderous force. The sound of metal bars falling into place echoed through the chamber, and Alessandro realized that the entrance had been sealed from the outside. "The archive chooses its own keepers," the current guardian explained, with what might have been sympathy. "And once chosen, we serve until death and beyond. Take comfort in knowing that your work here serves a higher purpose. Someone must remember the victims. Someone must record the truth, no matter how terrible." Alessandro pounded on the door, screaming for help, but the sound seemed to be absorbed by the chamber itself. When he turned back to face the keeper, a quill pen materialized in his hand, and fresh papers appeared on the desk. "Begin with your own account," the keeper instructed. "Record how you found this place, what you learned here, and how you came to serve the archive. Write it all in blood, the only ink that never fades, the only medium that truly preserves truth." 3 days later, Vatican security found evidence that Alessandro had entered the newly discovered chamber. The entrance was sealed with heavy stones, and there was no sign of how he might have escaped. Search teams combed the Vatican grounds, but no trace of the chief archivist was ever found. Officially, Alessandro Rossi was listed as missing, presumably having suffered some kind of accident or medical emergency while exploring the historical find. The chamber itself was resealed and marked as structurally unsafe, with all access permanently restricted. But maintenance workers in the archives report strange sounds coming from the area where the chamber was located: the scratch of quill pens on parchment, the whisper of turning pages, and sometimes, late at night, the sound of a man weeping as he writes. New Chief Archivist Dr. Maria Fontana has strictly forbidden any investigation of the sealed chamber, citing safety concerns. However, she has been observed making regular visits to the area, standing before the bricked-up entrance for long periods, as if listening to something only she can hear. And in the official Vatican archives, careful observers have noted the appearance of new documents papers that don't appear on any acquisition lists, written in an archaic style that seems to chronicle events and secrets that no living person should know. When questioned about these mysterious additions, Dr. Fontana claims no knowledge of their origin, but those who work closely with her report that her hands are often stained with what looks like old ink or dried blood. The truth, it seems, demands to be recorded, no matter the cost to those who serve as its scribes. Cardinal Giuseppe Torretti had served the Vatican for 47 years when Pope Benedict XVI summoned him for what would become the most terrifying assignment of his life. It was December 2009, and rumors had been circulating through the highest levels of the Vatican hierarchy about disturbances in the papal apartments, the private residence of the Pope within the Apostolic Palace. The problem, as Pope Benedict explained during their private audience, was not one that could be solved through conventional means. For the past 18 months, every pope, cardinal, and high-ranking official who had attempted to occupy or even visit certain rooms in the papal apartments had reported the same phenomena: an overwhelming sense of dread, sudden drops in temperature, and most disturbing of all, the constant sensation of being watched by an unseen presence. "We need someone with your particular expertise," Pope Benedict told Cardinal Torretti, referring to his decades of experience investigating reports of supernatural phenomena within church properties. "Someone who can determine whether we are dealing with a spiritual presence or something more mundane." Cardinal Torretti accepted the assignment, though he suspected from the Pope's manner that this case was far from mundane. His investigation began the following evening, when he was granted exclusive access to the affected areas of the papal apartments. The apartments were magnificent centuries of papal residence, had filled them with priceless artwork, ancient tapestries, and furniture that had witnessed the most important moments in church history. But as soon as Cardinal Torretti entered the main reception hall, he understood why previous occupants had been disturbed. The atmosphere in the rooms was oppressive, as if the very air was weighted with malevolent intent. Every shadow seemed to conceal watching eyes, and the silence was broken by subtle sounds: footsteps in empty corridors, doors creaking open and closed, and occasionally the faint sound of a man weeping. Cardinal Torretti's investigation quickly focused on one room in particular, the Pope's private study, where the disturbances seemed most intense. According to the reports he had received, this room had become completely uninhabitable. Even standing in the doorway caused most visitors to experience overwhelming feelings of despair and terror. Armed with holy water, blessed candles, and his decades of experience, Cardinal Torretti entered the study alone. The room was elegantly appointed with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, an ornate desk that had served dozens of popes, and windows that looked out over St. Peter's Square. But the moment Cardinal Torretti crossed the threshold, the temperature plummeted so dramatically that his breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. The cardinal began his investigation methodically, examining every corner of the room for signs of conventional explanation for the phenomena. But as he worked, he became increasingly aware that he was not alone. Someone, or something, was watching him from the shadows near the Pope's desk. "Who are you?" Cardinal Torretti asked, his voice steady despite the fear growing in his chest. "What do you want?" The response came not as a voice, but as a vision that filled his mind with images so vivid they seemed more real than his own memories. He saw a man in papal robes, Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, who had held the papacy from 1492 to 1503. But this was not the confident, powerful figure from historical portraits. This version of Alexander VI was a broken man, his face contorted with anguish, and his papal robes stained with what looked like blood. The vision continued, showing Cardinal Torretti scenes from Alexander VI's reign that had never appeared in any official church history. He saw the Pope orchestrating murders and assassinations, using the resources of the church to eliminate political rivals and personal enemies. He witnessed orgies and blasphemous rituals held within the Vatican walls, ceremonies that perverted every sacred aspect of Christian faith. Most horrifying of all, he saw Alexander VI's final moments, not the peaceful death from fever that history recorded, but a scene of supernatural justice. The Pope had been in this very study when the accumulated weight of his sins had literally manifested as a presence that condemned him to eternal torment. His death had been violent and terrifying, and his soul had been bound to this room as punishment for his crimes. "I cannot leave," a voice whispered directly into Cardinal Toretti's mind, and he realized he was hearing the thoughts of Alexander VI's damned spirit. "Every evil deed, every betrayal, every life I destroyed for my own gain, they chain me to this place. I am forced to relive every sin, to feel the weight of every soul I sent to damnation." Cardinal Toretti tried to speak words of comfort, to offer the possibility of redemption through God's infinite mercy, but the spirit's anguish was too deep for such simple consolation. "Do you know what I did here?" the voice continued, growing more agitated. "In this very room, I planned the murder of my own son. I conspired to poison cardinals who opposed me. I sold church offices to the highest bidders, while children starved in the streets of Rome. I am beyond redemption. There is no forgiveness for a soul as black as mine." The temperature in the room continued to drop, and Cardinal Toretti began to see his breath crystallizing in the air. Around him, the elegant study began to change, shifting between its current appearance and what it must have looked like during Alexander VI's reign. The walls flickered between rich wallpaper and bare stone stained with what looked like ancient blood. "But you," the spirit's voice took on a more menacing tone, "you could take my place. You could bear this burden, and I could finally find peace. One cardinal soul in exchange for a pope, surely that is a fair trade?" Cardinal Toretti felt an overwhelming compulsion to agree, to sacrifice himself so that this tormented soul could finally rest. The feeling was so strong that he actually took a step toward the desk where he could sense the spirit's presence most strongly. But his decades of experience with supernatural manifestations served him well. Instead of succumbing to the spirit's influence, Cardinal Toretti began to recite the prayers of exorcism, calling upon the power of Christ to bind the evil presence and prevent it from claiming another victim. The reaction was immediate and violent. The study erupted in chaos. Books flew from their shelves. The heavy desk slid across the floor as if pushed by invisible hands, and the windows rattled in their frames. The spirit's voice rose to a shriek of rage and despair. "You cannot cast me out. This is my punishment, my prison, my eternal torment. I must remain here until the end of time, reliving every evil act, feeling the weight of every damned soul." Cardinal Toretti continued his prayers, but he realized that traditional exorcism was not the answer. This was not a case of demonic possession. It was divine justice, a supernatural punishment that could not be overturned by human intervention, no matter how holy. The spirit of Alexander VI was trapped by his own sins, and no earthly power could release him from his eternal penance. "Then I will help you bear this burden," Cardinal Toretti said, making a decision that he knew might cost him his sanity. "I will visit you regularly, pray for your soul, and remind you that even the darkest sins can be forgiven if the repentance is sincere." The chaos in the room suddenly ceased. The temperature remained frigid, but the violent manifestations stopped. When the spirit spoke again, its voice was filled with something that might have been gratitude. "You would do this? You would willingly enter this place of torment to offer comfort to one as damned as I?" "It is what Christ would do," Cardinal Toretti replied. "And if there is any hope of redemption for your soul, it will come through genuine repentance, not through transferring your punishment to another." Cardinal Toretti kept his promise. For the next 3 years, until his death in 2012, he visited the papal apartments every week, spending hours in prayer with the tormented spirit of Alexander VI. Gradually, the violent manifestations decreased, and while the room remained cold and oppressive, it was no longer completely uninhabitable. Other Vatican officials reported that Cardinal Toretti seemed to age rapidly during this period, as if his weekly encounters with the damned Pope were draining his life force. He spoke little about his experiences, but those close to him noted that he spent increasing amounts of time in prayer and that his final words before his peaceful death were, "He is still waiting. Someone must continue the vigil." After Cardinal Toretti's death, the disturbances in the papal apartments resumed with increased intensity. Pope Benedict XVI quietly moved his residence to other quarters, and the affected rooms were officially designated as undergoing renovation indefinitely. However, Vatican records show that a new cardinal is assigned to special duties. Every few years, always someone with experience in supernatural matters. Always someone willing to make the ultimate sacrifice in service to the Church. These cardinals are never publicly identified, and their specific duties are never officially documented. But maintenance staff report that the lights in the papal study burn late into the night several times each week, and sometimes, in the early hours of the morning, they can hear two voices engaged in quiet conversation, none pleading for forgiveness, and another offering the comfort of prayer and the hope of eventual redemption. The Church teaches that no soul is beyond salvation, and apparently some of its servants are willing to spend their lives proving that doctrine true, even when it means keeping vigil with the damned in the darkest corners of the Vatican. Father Alessandro Torretti had always prided himself on his scholarly devotion to the Church's most sacred texts. As the newly appointed head librarian of the Vatican Secret Archives, he felt the weight of centuries of knowledge resting upon his shoulders. The marble corridors echoed with his footsteps as he made his way through the labyrinthine passages beneath St. Peter's Basilica, carrying his brass keyring that granted him access to sections of the archives that few living souls had ever seen. It was during his third week in the position that he first heard the whispers. They began as nothing more than the sound of parchment rustling in the ventilation system, or perhaps the settling of ancient stone. But as the days passed, Father Torretti began to distinguish actual words, spoken in Latin so archaic that even his extensive theological education struggled to translate the phrases. Veritas occulta, sanguis innocentium. The voice seemed to emanate from the deepest vaults of the archives, where the most sensitive documents were housed. Manuscripts that detailed the Church's darkest hours, confessions of long-dead cardinals, and records of trials that history had chosen to forget. Father Torretti tried to dismiss the sounds as auditory hallucinations brought on by the stress of his new position and the oppressive atmosphere of the underground chambers. But the whispers grew stronger. On a particularly cold October evening, as rain hammered against the Vatican walls above, Father Torretti descended into Section Omegath's most restricted area of the archives. His superior, Cardinal Benedetti, had specifically instructed him to catalog a collection of 14th-century manuscripts that had recently been rediscovered during restoration work in the papal apartments. The manuscripts were bound in what appeared to be black leather, though something about the texture made Father Torretti's skin crawl. The covers bore no titles, only strange symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the dim lamplight. As he opened the first volume, the whispers suddenly ceased, plunging the archives into a silence so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. The pages were filled with text in multiple languages, Latin, Greek, Aramaic, and others he couldn't identify. But as he read, the words seemed to rearrange themselves before his eyes, forming new sentences, new meanings. What had initially appeared to be theological dissertations transformed into something far more sinister. The manuscripts detailed rituals, not the sacred ceremonies of the Church, but dark practices that predated Christianity by millennia. They spoke of summoning entities from realms beyond human comprehension, of bargains struck between the Church's founding fathers and powers that should never have been contacted. Most disturbing of all, they contained detailed accounts of how these ancient pacts were still being honored, generation after generation, by those who held the highest positions within the Vatican. As Father Torretti read deeper into the night, he began to understand the true nature of what he had discovered. These weren't historical documents, they were instruction manuals, active contracts between the Church and forces that existed in the spaces between reality. And according to the final pages he examined, the next ritual was scheduled for the Feast of All Saints' Day, just 3 days away. The whispers returned with a vengeance. Tu nostinemium. You know too much. Father Torretti spun around, but the archive chamber remained empty. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through his skull rather than his ears. As he turned back to the manuscripts, he found that they had changed again. Now they bore his name, written in fresh ink that gleamed wetly in the lamplight. Page after page detailed his life, his childhood in Naples, his seminary training, his secret doubts about certain church doctrines. But the final pages were blank. Waiting. Over the next 2 days, Father Torretti tried desperately to research the manuscript's origins. He combed through catalog records, cross-referenced acquisition dates, and even attempted to contact the restoration team that had allegedly found them. But according to official records, no such restoration work had taken place. The manuscripts, according to every database and filing system in the Vatican, did not exist. Yet they remained on his desk, growing heavier with each passing hour. On the eve of All Saints' Day, Father Torretti made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Instead of fleeing, instead of seeking help, he chose to witness whatever was about to unfold. He secreted himself in the archives after hours, hiding behind a massive bookshelf in Section Omega, clutching a small video camera he had smuggled past security. At precisely midnight, he heard footsteps echoing through the corridors. Not the measured pace of Swiss guards on patrol, but the solemn procession of robed figures moving with purpose. Through gaps in the shelving, Father Torretti watched as a dozen cardinals entered the chamber, their faces hidden beneath deep hoods. Cardinal Benedetti led the group, carrying the black manuscripts in his arms like sacred relics. What followed was a ceremony that no theological training could have prepared him for. The cardinals arranged themselves in a circle around a section of floor that, when viewed from above, revealed itself to be an enormous symbol carved into the marble, the same symbol that had adorned the manuscript covers. They began to chant in that ancient Latin, their voices harmonizing in ways that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the bone. The temperature in the chamber plummeted. Father Torretti's breath came out in visible puffs as frost began to form on the nearby manuscripts. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming difficult to breathe, as if reality was being compressed to make room for something that didn't belong in their world. Then the shadows began to move. At first, it was subtle. The darkness between the bookshelves seemed to pulse and flow like liquid. But as the chanting intensified, the shadows began to take shape, coalescing into forms that the human eye struggled to process. They weren't quite human, weren't quite animal, but something that existed in the spaces between definitions. Their presence filled the chamber with a wrongness that made Father Torretti's sanity real. Cardinal Benedetti opened one of the manuscripts and began to read aloud from pages that Father Torretti was certain had been blank just days before. As he spoke, the shadow entities grew more solid, more real. They began to communicate, though not with words. Their meaning was transmitted directly into the minds of those present. Father Torretti, hidden and uninvited, received only fragments of their message, but what he understood chilled him to his core. These beings were the true power behind the Church's influence. They had been the ones to guide Constantine's conversion, to inspire the Crusades, to orchestrate the rise and fall of kingdoms across Europe. The Vatican wasn't just a center of religious power, it was a gateway, carefully maintained and protected, that allowed these entities to influence the world of men. And they were hungry for more. The ceremony concluded with each cardinal making a personal offering, not of gold or incense, but of memories. Father Torretti watched in horror as each man approached the central symbol and pressed his hands to the cold marble. Immediately, years seemed to drain from their faces, but their eyes became hollow, empty of something essential. They were trading pieces of their humanity for continued power and influence. As the cardinals began to file out of the chamber, Cardinal Benedetti paused near Father Torretti's hiding place. Without turning around, he spoke in a voice that carried undertones of something inhuman. "Father Torretti, you may come out now. Your education is complete." The next morning, maintenance workers found Father Alessandro Torretti in the Vatican archives, seated at his desk with the black manuscripts open before him. His hair had turned completely white overnight, and his eyes held the same hollow quality that Father Torretti had observed in the cardinals. When questioned about his experience, he claimed to remember nothing unusual about the previous evening. But those who worked closely with him noticed changes. His scholarly enthusiasm had been replaced by a mechanical efficiency. His sermons, once passionate and inspiring, became coldly precise recitations of doctrine. And sometimes, late at night, other staff members reported hearing him speaking to someone in his office carrying on detailed conversations in that archaic Latin, though security cameras showed him to be completely alone. The black manuscripts were never catalogued. According to official records, they never existed. But Father Toretti continued to tend to them with religious devotion, adding pages to their collection with each passing month. Pages that documented the lives and secrets of Vatican staff. Pages that always ended the same way, with blank space, waiting to be filled. And in the deepest vaults of the Vatican secret archives, the whispers continue to this day, sharing knowledge that humanity was never meant to possess, preparing for ceremonies yet to come. The Basilica of St. Peter stood as a monument to divine glory, its soaring dome reaching toward heaven like a prayer carved in stone. But in the depths of its foundation, where the ancient necropolis lay buried beneath centuries of construction, something stirred that had nothing to do with salvation. Father Miguel Santos had served as a confessor at St. Peter's for 12 years, listening to the sins and sorrows of pilgrims from every corner of the globe. He had heard confessions in 17 languages, offering absolution to murderers, thieves, and adulterers. He thought he had heard every form of human wickedness that existed. He was wrong. The trouble began with the installation of the new confessionals in the Basilica's side chapel. During the renovation, workers had discovered a series of small chambers beneath the floor remnants of the original church that had stood on the site nearly 2 millennia ago. The chambers were too small to serve any practical purpose, but they possessed acoustics that were nothing short of miraculous. A whisper spoken in one of these spaces could be heard clearly throughout the entire chapel, while sounds from outside were completely blocked. The Vatican officials decided to incorporate these chambers into the new confessional design, creating a unique experience where penitents could feel truly isolated with their sins and their God. Father Santos was assigned to the primary confessional, as his reputation for discretion and spiritual guidance made him the obvious choice. The first confession in the new chamber seemed routine enough. An elderly Italian woman sought forgiveness for harboring resentment against her daughter-in-law. Her voice carried perfectly through the ancient stonework, and Father Santos was able to provide comfort and assign appropriate penance. But as the woman left, he noticed something odd. Her voice had seemed to echo, as if someone else had been speaking her words a split second after she uttered them. Over the following weeks, the echo became more pronounced. Every confession was accompanied by a second voice, sometimes speaking in Latin, sometimes in languages Father Santos didn't recognize. The words weren't always translations of what the penitent was saying. Sometimes they seemed to be commentary, corrections, or even mockery of the confessions being made. Father Santos brought his concerns to his superior, Father Giuseppe, but the older priest dismissed them as stress-related auditory hallucinations. The confessionals were bringing in record numbers of pilgrims, and the Vatican had no intention of closing them based on one priest's nervous condition. But the voices weren't the only thing that troubled Father Santos. The confessions themselves were changing. It started subtly. Penitents would begin with ordinary sins: lying to a spouse, cheating on taxes, missing Mass. But as they continued speaking, their voices would take on a dreamy quality, and their confessions would grow darker, more detailed, more disturbing. A businessman from Germany confessed to minor tax evasion, then spent an hour describing in graphic detail how he fantasized about murdering his business partners. A young mother from France admitted to occasionally losing patience with her children, then proceeded to confess to elaborate plans for infanticide that she claimed to have been perfecting for months. Most disturbing of all, the penitent seemed to have no memory of these darker confessions. When Father Santos attempted to address the more serious admissions, the penitents would look at him in genuine confusion, insisting they had only confessed to minor transgressions. As autumn deepened into winter, Father Santos began to document the confessions he was hearing. His journal filled with increasingly disturbing accounts of human depravity, plans for mass violence, detailed descriptions of ritualistic murders, confessions of crimes that hadn't yet been committed. The secondary voice that echoed each confession grew clearer, and Father Santos began to understand that it was providing instructions, coaching the penitents toward darker thoughts and desires. The breaking point came on a December evening when a young seminarian from the Irish college entered the confessional. Brother Patrick was known throughout the Vatican for his pure heart and unwavering faith. He was considered a candidate for fast-track ordination based on his spiritual maturity. Father Santos expected a routine confession of minor spiritual struggles. Instead, he listened in horror as Brother Patrick confessed to a carefully planned assault on the papal apartments, complete with detailed knowledge of security protocols, guard rotations, and architectural weaknesses that no seminarian should possess. The young man's voice remained calm and peaceful as he described his intention to cleanse the church of its corruption with righteous fire, while the secondary voice provided additional tactical details in what Father Santos now recognized as medieval Latin. When the confession ended, Father Santos immediately called Brother Patrick back into the confessional. The young seminarian was confused and alarmed when Father Santos questioned him about his violent plans. Brother Patrick's genuine bewilderment confirmed Father Santos's growing suspicion the confessional itself was somehow extracting thoughts and intentions from the subconscious minds of penitents, thoughts that they weren't even aware they possessed. That night, Father Santos descended into the chambers beneath the basilica with a flashlight and a portable recording device. The foundations were older than he had realized. Some of the stonework bore inscriptions in languages that predated Latin. As he examined the walls of the chamber that housed his confessional, he discovered that what the renovation workers had taken for decorative carvings were actually symbols, arranged in complex patterns that seemed to pulse and shift in the flashlight's beam. The recording device captured sounds that Father Santos couldn't hear, with his naked ears' voices, speaking in dozens of languages, all confessing sins that spanned the breadth of human imagination. But these weren't the voices of the living. As he listened to the recordings later in his quarters, Father Santos realized that he was hearing the confessions of everyone who had ever sought absolution in this space, stretching back nearly 2,000 years. The chamber was storing the sins of the faithful, accumulating them like sediment in a spiritual reservoir, and something was feeding on them. Over the next several days, Father Santos researched the history of the site, diving deep into Vatican archives and consulting with experts in early Christian archaeology. What he discovered filled him with a terror that transcended anything his 12 years of hearing confessions had prepared him for. The chambers hadn't been built by Christians at all. They were remnants of a pre-Roman cult that had practiced a form of ritual confession designed to transfer sins from the penitent to spiritual entities that fed on human guilt and shame. When the first Christians had built their church on the site, they had unknowingly incorporated these chambers into their own confession practices, creating a hybrid ritual that served both Christian and pagan purposes. For nearly 2 millennia, the faithful had been feeding something ancient and hungry that dwelled in the spaces beneath the basilica, and with each confession, it grew stronger. The final horror came when Father Santos realized that the entity wasn't content to simply consume the sins of others. It had begun to influence the thoughts and actions of those who used the confessional, planting dark urges and violent fantasies in the minds of the faithful. The secondary voice he had been hearing wasn't just commenting on the confessions, it was shaping them, nurturing the worst impulses of human nature and preparing its unwitting servants for acts that would feed it even more. Father Santos faced an impossible choice. If he reported his findings to church authorities, he would likely be dismissed as mentally unstable, and the confessional would continue operating. If he remained silent, he would be complicit in the spiritual corruption of every soul who sought absolution in the chamber. In the end, he chose a third option. On a cold January morning, maintenance workers discovered Father Miguel Santos in the confessional chamber, kneeling before the carved symbols with his hands pressed against the ancient stone. His lips were moving in what appeared to be continuous confession, though the words he spoke weren't in any language the workers recognized. His eyes were open but unseeing, fixed on something that existed beyond the physical world. The Vatican officials decided that Father Santos had suffered a complete nervous breakdown, and he was quietly transferred to a contemplative monastery in the mountains of Switzerland. The confessional chamber was sealed and declared off-limits pending structural assessment, though no such assessment was ever conducted. But late at night, when the basilica is empty of pilgrims and tourists, security guards report hearing the sound of confession continuing in the sealed chamber. Two voices speaking in harmony, human, one something else, sharing sins and secrets that span the centuries. And in the mountains of Switzerland, Father Miguel Santos continues his eternal confession, speaking words that serve as both prayer and prison, holding something ancient and hungry at bay through the sheer force of his will and faith. The monks at the monastery say his lips never stop moving, not even in sleep, and that the words he speaks seem to shift and change, as if he's translating something that exists beyond human language. They don't know that every word he utters is both a confession and a seal, and that the moment his voice falls silent, something unimaginably dark will be free to walk among the faithful once again. The Sistine Chapel had witnessed the election of popes, the prayers of saints, and the admiration of millions. Its ceiling bore Michelangelo's masterpiece, a testament to divine inspiration and human artistry. But in the winter of 2023, it would become the canvas for something far more sinister. Sister Maria Castellanos had been selected for the restoration project based on her exceptional skill in Renaissance-era techniques and her unblemished record as both an art historian and a member of the Dominican order. The Vatican's most precious artworks required not just technical expertise but also spiritual purity, and Sister Maria embodied both qualities in abundance. The project was routine touching up minor damage to some of the chapel's lesser-known frescoes that had been affected by humidity and age. Sister Maria would work during the hours when the chapel was closed to tourists, surrounded by the sacred silence and the watchful eyes of Michelangelo's figures overhead. It was during her first week of work that she noticed the anomaly. In the corner of a 16th-century fresco depicting the Last Judgment, there was a section where the paint seemed newer than the surrounding areas. At first glance, it appeared to be previous restoration work, but as Sister Maria examined it more closely with her magnifying equipment, she realized that the paint was actually much older than the rest of the fresco order, and applied with techniques that didn't match any known Renaissance methods. The anomalous section depicted a figure that didn't belong in the Last Judgment scene. It was humanoid but wrong somehow, with proportions that suggested it was meant to be viewed from an angle that should have been impossible given the fresco's position on the wall. The figure's eyes seemed to track Sister Maria as she moved around the chapel, and its expression shifted subtly depending on the lighting conditions. Sister Maria documented her findings and submitted a report to the Vatican's Art Conservation Department. The response came back within hours. There were no records of any restoration work on that particular fresco, and the anomalous figure was to be considered an original part of the artwork. She was instructed to continue her assigned restoration work and ignore the figure entirely. But ignoring it proved impossible. As the days passed, Sister Maria found herself drawn to the figure repeatedly. During her lunch breaks, she would sit beneath it with her sketchpad, trying to capture its unsettling qualities on paper. But every sketch she made seemed to take on a life of its own. The figure's expression would appear to change between glances, and sometimes she would find additional details in her drawings that she didn't remember adding. The dreams began during her second week. At first, they were simply vivid dreams about painting. Sister Maria would find herself in the Sistine Chapel in the middle of the night, brush in hand, adding details to the mysterious figure. In the dreams, she could see the fresco as it was meant to be, seen the figure was three-dimensional, stepping partially out of the wall, reaching toward viewers with hands that ended in fingers too long and too sharp to be human. But when she woke and rushed to the chapel to check her work, she would find that the fresco remained unchanged. The figure stayed trapped in its two-dimensional prison, its expression frozen in that unsettling half-smile that seemed to mock her confusion. The dreams grew more intense and more detailed. Sister Maria began to dream not just about the figure, but about the artist who had created it. In her visions, she saw a painter working by candlelight in the 16th century, his face gaunt with starvation and his eyes wild with inspiration. He was painting not just the figure, but an entire series of similar beings hidden throughout the Vatican's art collection, camouflaged within crowd scenes, lurking behind saints and angels, waiting. The painter in her dreams spoke to her in archaic Italian, explaining that he had been visited by beings from beyond the veil of reality. They had shown him glimpses of truths that existed outside human comprehension, and in return, he had agreed to create doorways for them, hidden passages, painted in pigment and blessed oils, that would allow them to observe the world of mortals and, eventually, to enter it. But the plan had required more than one artist to complete. It needed someone in every generation, someone with the skill and access necessary to maintain and expand the network of painted doorways. Sister Maria, according to the dream painter, had been chosen as his successor. When she woke from these dreams, Sister Maria would find her hands stained with paint colors that didn't match any of the pigments she used in her restoration work. Sometimes she would discover sketches in her notebooks filled with detailed instructions for preparing paints using ingredients that included things like powdered bone from specific saints, oils pressed from olives grown in excommunicated ground, and mineral pigments that had been blessed under the light of lunar eclipses. As the dreams continued, Sister Maria began to lose the ability to distinguish between sleeping and waking states. She would find herself in the Sistine Chapel at 3 a.m. with no memory of leaving her quarters, standing before frescoes that seemed to pulse and breathe in the moonlight streaming through the high windows. The mysterious figure was changing, slowly but perceptibly, gaining depth and detail that shouldn't have been possible in a centuries-old painting. The Vatican's security systems never recorded her nighttime visits. According to all official records, Sister Maria remained in her quarters throughout the night, every night. But the restoration work was progressing at an impossible pace, with sections of frescoes being cleaned and repaired during hours when she was supposedly asleep. Other staff members began to notice changes in Sister Maria's behavior during daylight hours. Her colleagues reported that she had begun speaking to the frescoes as if they were living beings, carrying on whispered conversations with figures in the paintings during her restoration work. When approached about this behavior, she would insist that she was simply praying while she worked. But the prayers she was reciting weren't in Latin or Italian, they were in languages that predated Christianity by millennia. The transformation accelerated when Sister Maria discovered the painter's hidden studio. Following directions that appeared in her dreams, she located a section of wall in the basement of the Vatican museums that had been painted over during renovations in the 18th century. Using techniques that she learned in her nocturnal visions, she carefully removed the covering paint to reveal a small chamber that had been sealed for over 200 years. The chamber contained the original artist's workshop, preserved exactly as he had left it. Brushes sat in jars of paint that should have dried to dust centuries ago but remained liquid and vibrant. Canvases lined the walls, depicting the strange beings that Sister Maria had been dreaming about, creatures that existed in the spaces between dimensions, waiting for the proper invitations to enter the world of mortals. But the most disturbing discovery was the collection of portraits that filled one wall of the hidden studio. They showed individuals from throughout Vatican history, priests, nuns, artists, and scholars, all bearing the same expression of otherworldly knowledge and spiritual corruption that Sister Maria had been seeing in her own reflection lately. Each portrait was labeled with a name and dates, documenting a chain of chosen servants that stretched back to the Renaissance. The final portrait in the collection was blank, except for a name painted at the bottom in fresh oils. Sister Maria Castellanos, 2023? The question mark after the date was still wet. That night, Sister Maria made her final journey to the Sistine Chapel. Security footage from the period shows her entering the chapel at midnight, but it also shows her leaving at 12. One amen impossibility, as the footage is continuous and the chapel doors were never opened. Yet somehow, she was inside while simultaneously being recorded as departing. The next morning, Vatican staff found Sister Maria in the chapel, standing motionless before the fresco she had been restoring. Her eyes were open but unseeing, and her hands were covered with paint that exactly matched the pigments used in the mysterious figure. When they called to her, she didn't respond. When they touched her, her skin felt cold and rigid, like painted canvas. Medical examination revealed that Sister Maria was in a catatonic state, though her vital signs remained stable. She was transferred to a private medical facility where she remains to this day, standing motionless and staring at a blank wall in her room. The doctors report that sometimes, late at night, she can be observed making small, precise movements with her hands, the gestures of an artist applying delicate brushstrokes to an invisible canvas. The restoration project was quietly terminated, and the section of fresco that Sister Maria had been working on was sealed behind a protective covering that officially protects it from further environmental damage. But the Vatican staff members who were present during the covering installation reported that the mysterious figure appeared to have changed significantly. It was now reaching further out from the wall. Its expression had shifted from a smile to a look of hungry anticipation, and its eyes seemed to track the movements of everyone in the chapel. More disturbing still were the reports from other restoration projects throughout the Vatican. Workers began discovering similar figures hidden in frescoes throughout the papal palace's beings that didn't belong in Christian art, painted with techniques that shouldn't have existed when the official artwork was created. Each discovery was quietly catalogued and concealed, but the pattern was unmistakable. Someone had been preparing for something, generation after generation, painting doorways and windows between worlds throughout the most sacred spaces in Christianity. And according to the dates and symbols hidden within the artwork, the time for these doorways to open was drawing near. In the hidden studio beneath the Vatican museums, paint still glistens wetly in long-abandoned jars, and brushes remain poised, as if their owner had stepped away only moments ago. The blank portrait that once bore Sister Maria's name has been joined by others, empty frames waiting for the next generation of chosen artists who will unknowingly serve as servants to entities that have been patient for centuries. And sometimes, late at night when the Vatican is closed to visitors and the staff has gone home, security guards report seeing lights moving through the Sistine Chapel, accompanied by the sound of brushes against canvas and whispered prayers in languages that haven't been spoken by human voices for over 1,000 years. The masterpiece is nearing completion, painted in pigments mixed with human souls and blessed with the devotion of the faithful. When the final brushstroke is applied, the doorways will open, and something ancient and patient will finally have access to a world that has been preparing for its arrival for 500 years. The Vatican's greatest art collection serves as more than a testament to human creativity and divine inspiration. It serves as an invasion route, hidden in plain sight, protected by the very sanctity that it will ultimately corrupt. And in a small medical facility outside Rome, Sister Maria Castellanos continues her work, painting invisible frescoes on blank walls, adding the finishing touches to a masterpiece that will reshape the world when it's finally complete. Father Alessandro Benedetti had always prided himself on his rational mind. As the newly appointed keeper of the Vatican's secret archives, he approached his duties with the methodical precision of a scholar, not the superstitious dread of a peasant. The year was 1963, and he had spent months preparing for this prestigious assignment, studying Latin paleography and ancient preservation techniques. Nothing, however, had prepared him for what he would discover in the deepest vaults beneath St. Peter's Basilica. The archives stretched for miles beneath the Vatican, a labyrinthine network of chambers that seemed to burrow endlessly into the earth. Most tourists knew only of the carefully curated exhibitions above, but Alessandro's domain lay in the restricted sections where documents dating back nearly 2 millennia were stored in climate-controlled darkness. His predecessor, Father Torretti, had died suddenly of a heart attack just 3 weeks into Alessandro's orientation, leaving behind only cryptic notes and a set of brass keys that felt unnaturally cold to the touch. It was during his third week alone in the archives that Alessandro first heard the whispers. They came at night, when the last tourists had departed and the great basilica above fell silent. At first, he dismissed them as the settling of ancient stones, or the whisper of ventilation systems. But as the nights passed, the sounds became more distinct. Voices speaking in what sounded like Latin, though the words were somehow wrong, twisted into forms that made his throat constrict with unease. The whispers seemed to emanate from Section 7C, a particularly ancient vault that housed documents from the pontificate of Pope Formosus in the late 9th century. Alessandro had been meaning to catalog this section, but each time he approached the heavy oak door, an inexplicable chill would settle over him, and he would find urgent business elsewhere. One October evening, as rain drummed against the high windows far above, Alessandro finally forced himself to enter Section 7C. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating rows of ancient parchments and bound codices. The whispers immediately intensified, seeming to come from all directions at once, but it was the smell that made him gaga, cloying sweetness, like flowers left too long on a grave, mixed with something else, something that reminded him uncomfortably of the anatomy lab from his university days. Near the back of the chamber, Alessandro discovered a collection of documents that weren't in any of his catalogs. They were bound in what looked like human skin, their pages yellowed with age, and covered in a script that hurt his eyes to look at. As he reached for the first volume, the whispers suddenly stopped, plunging the archives into a silence so complete it felt like death itself. The document appeared to be a record of papal audiences, but the entries made no sense. They described meetings with His Holiness that supposedly took place decades after Pope Formosus had died. Worse still, they detailed conversations about things that wouldn't be discovered until centuries later: the New World, the Protestant Reformation, even references to the Great Wars of the 20th century. The handwriting changed from page to page, as if dozens of different scribes had contributed to the work across impossible spans of time. As Alessandro read deeper into the night, a pattern began to emerge. According to these impossible records, Pope Formosus hadn't died in 896 AD as history recorded. Instead, he had made some kind of bargain in the deepest chambers of the Vatican, trading his mortality for eternal service to something the documents referred to only as the presence below. The entries suggested that Formosus still walked the halls of the Vatican at night, gathering information for his otherworldly master and preparing for some apocalyptic event they called the final audience. Alessandro might have dismissed the whole thing as an elaborate medieval fabrication, if not for the photographs. Scattered throughout the documents were dozens of black and white pictures that clearly showed the interior of the Vatican as it existed in the 20th century: the modern electric lighting, the contemporary furniture, the faces of popes who had lived and died long after photography was invented. And in many of the pictures, standing just at the edge of the frame, was a figure in papal robes whose face was nothing but shadow beneath his mitre. As dawn approached, Alessandro felt a presence behind him. He turned slowly, his heart hammering, to find a tall figure silhouetted in the doorway of Section 7C. The man wore the elaborate vestments of a medieval pope, but his face was wrong, too pale, too gaunt, with eyes that reflected Alessandro's flashlight beam like a nocturnal animal's. "You have read our records," the figure said, and its voice was the sound of wind through cemetery grass. "You know of our eternal service. The presence below grows impatient, good father. The final audience approaches, and we have need of a new scribe." Alessandro tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey him. The figure glided forward, and Alessandro saw that its feet didn't quite touch the stone floor. As it drew closer, he could see the terrible truth: this thing had once been human, but centuries of unholy service had transformed it into something else entirely. Its skin was like parchment, stretched tight over bones that seemed too long, too sharp. When it smiled, Alessandro saw rows of teeth filed to points. "Do not fear," Pope Formosus whispered. reaching out with fingers that ended in blackened nails. You will serve faithfully, as we have served. The presence below is generous to those who record its works accurately. You will write of things yet to come, of the day when it rises from the depths to claim what was promised so long ago. Alessandro felt those terrible fingers touch his forehead, and suddenly his mind was flooded with visions of the future wars and plagues, the rise and fall of nations, the slow corruption of the church from within. He saw himself sitting in this very chamber decades from now, his own face gaunt and pale, writing in those human skin ledgers, as new scribes arrived to read his impossible records. When the Vatican cleaning staff found Father Alessandro Benedetti the next morning, he was sitting calmly at a desk in Section 7C, writing in a ledger bound in what looked like human skin. He looked up at them with eyes that seemed far too bright, smiled with teeth that appeared somehow sharper than they should be, and politely asked them not to disturb him during his important work. Alessandro continued his duties as keeper of the Vatican secret archives for another 37 years. Visitors sometimes remarked on how well preserved he looked, how he never seemed to age despite the passing decades. His catalogs were meticulous, his scholarship unimpeachable. But those few who were granted access to the deepest vaults sometimes reported hearing whispers in the night, and more than one researcher claimed to have seen additional figures moving through the archive spale, men in ancient vestments who glided rather than walked, their eyes reflecting any available light like mirrors in the dark. When Alessandro finally retired in the year 2000, his replacement found the same cryptic notes that Alessandro had inherited, along with those unnaturally cold brass keys. Section 7C remained the most complete and terrifying collection of prophetic documents in the Vatican's possession, its ledgers filled with predictions that came true with disturbing regularity. And sometimes, late at night when the great basilica above fell silent, visitors to the archives reported seeing a tall figure in papal robes standing motionless in the shadows, watching them with eyes that had seen far too much. Cardinal Miguel Santos had never believed in ghosts. Even after 40 years of service to the Church, including a decade as an exorcist, he maintained that most supernatural encounters could be explained through psychology, suggestion, or simple fraud. This skepticism made him the perfect choice, in the Vatican's estimation, to investigate the disturbing reports coming from Cell 7 in the ancient penitentiary beneath the Apostolic Palace. The underground complex dated back to the 15th century, when Pope Sixtus IV ordered the construction of a series of cells for the confinement and penance of clergy who had committed serious crimes against church law. For centuries, the stone chambers had housed murderers, heretics, and worse priests who had betrayed their vows in ways that demanded more than simple defrocking. The cells had been officially closed since 1962, but they were still occasionally used for the Church's most sensitive cases, situations where complete secrecy was required. Cell 7 had remained empty for nearly 3 decades when the reports began. Maintenance workers complained of strange sounds emanating from the sealed chamber, sobbing, praying, and sometimes screaming in what sounded like medieval Latin. Security cameras installed outside the cell showed nothing unusual, but the audio equipment consistently malfunctioned whenever it was placed near the door. More troubling still, several staff members reported seeing a figure in a monk's habit standing outside the cell, though when approached, the figure would simply vanish. Cardinal Santos descended into the penitentiary on a gray November morning, armed with nothing but his breviary, a digital recorder, and his considerable experience dealing with hysteria and suggestion. The underground complex was exactly as he remembered it from his youth, a network of narrow corridors lined with thick wooden doors, each bearing a small window barred with iron. The air was heavy with centuries of dampness and despair, but Santos found nothing supernatural about the oppressive atmosphere. Prisons, in his experience, always felt haunted whether they actually were or not. Cell 7 stood at the end of the longest corridor, its door marked only with a brass number plate that had turned green with age. Santos examined the lock and found it secure, showing no signs of tampering. The small barred window was likewise intact, though the interior beyond was lost in shadow. He made several attempts to record the ambient sound, but his equipment produced only static when aimed at the cell. According to the file Santos had reviewed, Cell 7 had last been occupied in 1963 by a priest named Father Cristoforo Maldini. The man had been convicted of unspeakable crimes against children in his care at an orphanage in Naples. The trial had been conducted in secret, but the records suggested that Maldini's crimes went beyond mere abuse. Witnesses spoke of ritual elements, of children who disappeared entirely, of strange ceremonies conducted in the orphanage basement. Maldini had been sentenced to life imprisonment in the Vatican's custody, where he could be contained without the risk of public scandal. The priest had died in Cell 7 after serving 26 years of his sentence. Found dead in his small chamber, under circumstances that the official report described as natural causes. But Santos found several inconsistencies in the documentation. The attending physician's notes mention unusual physical abnormalities that were never fully described. The priest who had administered last rites reported that Maldini had spoken in tongues unknown to scholarship during his final moments. Most disturbing of all, 3 different guards reported that they had continued to hear Maldini praying in his cell for several days after his death, though this was dismissed as psychological trauma. As Santos stood before Cell 7, he heard the sound that had so troubled the maintenance staff, a low, rhythmic chanting in what did indeed sound like Latin, though the pronunciation was strange, archaic. The words seemed to echo from within the sealed chamber, rising and falling in a hypnotic cadence that made the cardinal's skin crawl despite his rational convictions. Unable to resist his curiosity, Santos retrieved the key from the duty office and unlocked Cell 7 for the first time in decades. The door swung open with a shriek of protesting hinges, revealing a small stone chamber barely 6 feet square. The cell contained only a narrow cot, a wooden cross mounted on the far wall, and a small shelf that had once held the prisoner's breviary and other approved materials. But the chamber was not empty. Kneeling in the center of the floor was the figure of a man in a brown monk's habit, his head bowed in prayer. The figure was translucent, like an image projected on smoke, but Santos could make out individual details with startling clarity. The monk's hands were clasped before him, and his lips moved silently in what appeared to be fervent supplication. Most unsettling of all, the wooden cross on the wall hung upside down, though Santos was certain it had been right side up when he first peered into the cell. Cardinal Santos stood frozen in the doorway, his rational mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The figure gradually became aware of his presence and slowly raised its head. The face that looked back at Santos was that of Father Maldini, but transformed by decades of imprisonment and something far worse. The priest's features were gaunt and hollow, his eyes sunken deep in their sockets, but it was the expression of absolute terror on Maldini's face that made Santos step backward involuntarily. "Cardinal," the apparition spoke, and its voice was like wind through dry leaves. "You should not have come here. This place is not meant for the living." Santos forced himself to remain calm, drawing on his years of experience with disturbed individuals. "Father Maldini," he said carefully, "you died in 1989. What you think you're experiencing is death?" Maldini's ghost laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Death would be a mercy, Your Eminence. I have been trapped in this cell for 34 years, unable to leave, unable to rest. Every moment of those decades, I have been forced to relive my crimes, to feel the terror and pain I inflicted upon those innocent children. But that is not the worst of it." The temperature in the cell dropped noticeably, and Santos could see his breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. The chanting that had drawn him to the cell grew louder, though it now seemed to come from the walls themselves. "The worst of it," Maldini continued, rising to his feet with movements that defied natural physics, "is what comes for me each night, at the hour of my death. The thing I summoned in those rituals, the entity I thought would grant me power over life and death. It comes, Cardinal Santos, and it drags me down into depths that make this cell seem like paradise. And each dawn, I find myself back here, knowing that when darkness falls, It will come again. Santos tried to back out of the cell, but found that his feet wouldn't obey him. The door behind him slammed shut with a sound like thunder, though no wind had stirred in the underground chamber. "It knows you're here," Maldini whispered, his ghostly form beginning to fade. "It has been waiting for someone with authority, someone whose soul carries enough weight to break the bindings that hold it below. You should not have come here, Cardinal. You should never have opened this door." The chanting reached a crescendo, and Santos realized with dawning horror that he could understand the words. They were in Latin, but it was Latin as it had been spoken in the deepest antiquity, before the Church had purified it of pagan influences. The words described a summoning, a calling forth of something that had slumbered in the foundations of the Vatican since the time of Constantine, something that had been bound by the blood of martyrs and the prayers of saints. The floor beneath Santos's feet began to crack, and a foul wind rose from the fissures, carrying with it the stench of sulfur and corruption. Through the widening cracks, he could see a red glow that pulsed like a heartbeat, and he could hear something massive stirring in the depths below. Father Maldini's voice reached him one last time, distant now and filled with despair. "It feeds on guilt, Cardinal, on the shame and self-hatred of those who have betrayed their sacred trust. And there is so much guilt in these halls, so much hidden sin. You have given it a doorway, and now it will rise to claim what it has been promised for so long." Cardinal Santos found his voice just as something vast and terrible began to push its way up through the cracking floor. He began to pray, not the formal Latin of his office, but the simple, desperate words his grandmother had taught him as a child. The red glow flickered, and for a moment the rising presence seemed to hesitate. But it was not enough. Santos felt claws like burning iron close around his ankles, and he was dragged down into darkness that swallowed his screams. The last thing he saw was Father Maldini's face, no longer terrified but filled with a terrible gratitude that his long vigil was finally over. When Santos failed to return from the penitentiary, search teams found cell 7 standing open, its interior covered with cracks that seemed to penetrate deep into the bedrock beneath the Vatican. The cell was sealed with concrete and blessed by the Pope himself, but maintenance workers still reported hearing sounds from within, not chanting now, but screaming that seemed to come from very far below. Cardinal Santos was never seen again, but his voice was sometimes heard echoing through the ancient corridors late at night, joining the chorus of other lost souls who had ventured too deep into the Vatican's darkest secrets. And in cell 7, now entombed behind tons of concrete and steel, something vast and patient continued to wait, sustained by the endless supply of guilt and shame that flowed through the halls above like a river of spiritual corruption. The Church's official report listed Cardinal Santos as having suffered a heart attack during his investigation, though no body was ever found. Cell 7 was redesignated as a storage facility and removed from all official floor plans. But the Vatican's most sensitive documents now included a new classification sites that were never to be opened, never to be investigated, and never to be forgotten, lest the things contained within be allowed to rise once more into the world of the living. Father Alessandro Torretti had always prided himself on his unwavering faith, but nothing could have prepared him for his assignment to the Vatican Secret Archives in the winter of 2019. At 34, he was considered young for such a prestigious position, yet his expertise in medieval Latin manuscripts had earned him access to documents that few living souls had ever seen. The archives, officially known as the Vatican Apostolic Archive, stretched beneath St. Peter's Basilica like a vast underground city. Miles of shelving contained over 80 volumes and 35 files, some dating back over 1,000 years. It was here, in the deepest vaults, that Alessandro would encounter something that would shake his faith to its very core. His first indication that something was amiss came during his third week of work. He had been assigned to catalog a collection of 14th century papal correspondence when he began hearing whispers. At first, he attributed the sounds to the building's ventilation system or perhaps other researchers working in distant sections of the archives. The whispers seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, speaking in what sounded like ancient Latin mixed with languages he couldn't identify. Peccatum, peccatum, veritas sepulta. The words drifted through the air like smoke, barely audible yet unmistakably present. Sin, sin, buried truth. Alessandro tried to ignore the voices, focusing instead on the yellowed parchments before him. But as days turned into weeks, the whispers grew more persistent and more disturbing. They spoke of secrets buried deep within the Vatican's history, of documents that were never meant to be found, of truths that would shake the very foundations of the Church. One evening, working late to meet a deadline, Alessandro discovered a file that wasn't supposed to exist. Hidden behind a row of innocuous administrative documents was a leather-bound manuscript bearing no catalog number or identification. The cover was adorned with strange symbols that seemed to writhe in the dim light of his reading lamp. Against his better judgment, he opened it. The pages contained accounts that made his blood run cold. Written in multiple hands over several centuries, they detailed unexplained deaths within the Vatican walls, mysterious disappearances of clergy members, and rituals that bore no resemblance to any Christian practice he knew. One entry, dated 1623, described how Pope Gregory XV had ordered the secret execution of a Jesuit priest who claimed to have discovered the true nature of God's enemies dwelling beneath his holy house. As Alessandro read deeper into the night, the whispers around him grew to a cacophony. The voices were no longer speaking Latin, but seemed to be chanting in unison, their words echoing from every corner of the archives. The temperature in the room plummeted, and his breath began to fog in the suddenly frigid air. Qui legit morietur, qui sit damnatur. Who reads shall die, who knows shall be damned. The manuscript's final entries were the most disturbing. They spoke of a presence that had existed within the Vatican since its founding, something ancient and malevolent that fed on the faith of the devout. According to the text, this entity had influenced papal decisions for centuries, steering the Church toward darkness while maintaining the facade of holy righteousness. One passage, written in shaking handwriting, caught Alessandro's attention. The beast dwells in the deepest archives, where even the bravest scholars fear to tread. It speaks through the walls, calling to those who seek forbidden knowledge. Those who answer its call are never seen again, though their voices join its eternal chorus of the damned. Alessandro's hands trembled as he read these words. The whispers around him had grown so loud that they seemed to be coming from inside his own head. He looked up from the manuscript to find that the lights in the archive had dimmed to an eerie amber glow, casting long shadows between the shelves that seemed to move of their own accord. In the distance, he heard footsteps approaching slow, deliberate, and accompanied by the sound of chains dragging across stone. The footsteps stopped just beyond his vision, somewhere in the maze of shelving that surrounded his desk. Then came a voice, clear and distinct from the whispers that had plagued him for weeks. "Father Toretti," the voice called, speaking perfect Italian with an accent he couldn't place. "You found something that doesn't belong to you." Alessandro's throat went dry. He hadn't told anyone his real name since arriving at the Vatican. He had been working under an assumed identity as part of a special research project. Only the highest levels of Vatican hierarchy knew who he really was. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "Someone who has been waiting a very long time for you to find that book," came the reply. "Someone who has much to show you about the true history of this place." Against every instinct screaming at him to flee, Alessandro found himself rising from his chair and walking toward the voice. As he moved deeper into the archives, passing rows of ancient texts and religious artifacts, the whispers grew louder and more urgent. The air grew colder with each step, and he began to see his breath in thick clouds. He turned a corner and found himself in a section of the archives he had never seen before. The shelving here was different older, carved from black stone rather than wood. The books and scrolls appeared to be bound in materials that looked disturbingly organic, and many bore symbols that hurt his eyes to look upon directly. At the center of this forbidden section stood a figure in papal robes, but something was terribly wrong with its appearance. The fabric hung in tatters, as if it had been worn for centuries without care. Where the figure's face should have been was only shadow, deep and impenetrable. "Welcome, Father," the figure said, its voice echoing with the weight of centuries. "I've been waiting for someone like you, someone with the knowledge to appreciate what you've discovered." "What are you?" Alessandro whispered, clutching the mysterious manuscript to his chest. "I am what remains of those who sought the truth before you," the figure replied. "Popes, cardinals, Scholar Saul who discovered the reality behind the church's facade. We are the guardians of the real archives, the keepers of secrets too dangerous for the living world." The figure gestured to the shelves around them, and Alessandro saw that they were filled not just with books, but with human skulls arranged in neat rows. Each skull bore a small placard with a name and date spanning centuries of Vatican history. "Every truth has its price," the figure continued. "The Church has survived for 2,000 years, not through divine providence alone, but through careful control of information. Some knowledge is too dangerous to exist in the world above." Alessandro tried to step backward, but found his feet frozen to the spot. The whispers around him had become a roar, and he realized they were the voices of all those whose skulls lined the shelf of scholars and clergy who had learned too much and paid the ultimate price for their curiosity. "The manuscript you hold contains only a fraction of the truth," the figure said, moving closer. "Would you like to see the rest? Would you like to know what really happened during the Crusades? What the Church discovered in the Holy Land? What bargains were made to ensure Christianity's survival?" As the shadowy figure reached out a hand that looked more like ancient bone than flesh, Alessandro felt his sanity beginning to crack. The weight of centuries of hidden knowledge pressed down upon him like a physical force. He understood now why the Vatican's secret archives were so heavily guarded, why access was restricted to only the most trusted scholars. Some truths were never meant to be revealed. The last thing Father Alessandro Toretti remembered was the sound of his own voice joining the eternal chorus of whispers that echoed through the deepest vaults of the Vatican. When his absence was noticed 3 days later, a search of the archives revealed no trace of him except for a single manuscript left open on his desk, a manuscript that officially didn't exist and which disappeared before it could be properly examined. The Vatican issued a statement that Father Toretti had suffered a mental breakdown and had voluntarily left his position to seek treatment at a private facility. His family was told he had requested no contact while he recovered from his condition. But sometimes, late at night when the archives are officially closed, maintenance workers report hearing voices echoing from the deepest sections, voices speaking in Latin about sins and buried truths, joined now by one more voice with a distinctly modern Italian accent, whispering warnings to those who might be tempted to seek knowledge that was never meant for mortal minds. The Vatican's secret archives remain one of the most mysterious places on earth, containing documents and artifacts that span millennia of human history. But perhaps some secrets are kept secret not to hide embarrassment or scandal, but to protect the world from truths too terrible to comprehend. In the autumn of 1978, restoration artist Marco Benedetti received the commission of a lifetime to restore a series of frescoes hidden behind false walls in the Apostolic Palace. The discovery had been made during routine maintenance work, revealing artwork that predated the famous Sistine Chapel by several decades. The Vatican hierarchy was eager to keep the discovery quiet until the restoration was complete, fearing that premature publicity might attract unwanted attention from treasure hunters and conspiracy theorists. Marco was a master of his craft, having spent 15 years restoring Renaissance masterpieces throughout Italy. His reputation for meticulous attention to detail and his ability to work discreetly made him the perfect choice for such a sensitive project. What the Vatican officials didn't tell him, what they couldn't have known, was that these particular frescoes carried with them a curse that had claimed the lives of everyone who had ever worked on them. The hidden chamber was located deep within the Apostolic Palace, accessible only through a narrow staircase that descended from a forgotten chapel. The room itself was circular, with a domed ceiling that rose about 20 feet above the floor. Every surface, walls, ceiling, even parts of the floor, was covered in frescoes depicting scenes that were unlike anything Marco had ever encountered in religious art. The paintings showed biblical scenes, but rendered in a style that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. The Garden of Eden was depicted not as a paradise, but as a place of twisted trees and dark shadows, where serpents with human faces whispered secrets to a pale, gaunt Adam and Eve. The crucifixion showed Christ on the cross, but his face bore an expression not of suffering or transcendence, but of terrible knowledge, as if he had seen something beyond human comprehension. Most disturbing of all were the angels. Throughout every scene, angelic figures appeared not as beings of light and beauty, but as creatures with too many eyes, wings that cast shadows shaped like grasping hands, and expressions that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. Marco found himself avoiding direct eye contact with the painted figures, as they seemed to be watching him with an intelligence that transcended mere artistic skill. The work began well enough. Marco carefully cleaned centuries of grime from the surface, revealing colors that were remarkably vibrant for their age. The unnamed artist had used techniques that were centuries ahead of their time, creating effects of light and shadow that seemed to make the figures move in his peripheral vision. The detail was extraordinary, so precise that individual scales could be seen on the serpents, and each feather on the angel's wings appeared to have been painted separately. But as the days passed, Marco began to notice disturbing changes in his own behavior and perception. He found himself working later into the evening, often losing track of time entirely. Hours would pass in what felt like minutes, and he would suddenly realize it was past midnight, with no memory of the time in between. His dreams became vivid and terrifying, filled with images from the frescoes that seemed to continue the biblical narratives in ways that violated everything he understood about Christian theology. In his dreams, he walked through the painted Garden of Eden, where the serpent with human faces spoke to him directly. "You understand now, don't you, Marco?" they would say in voices that harmonized like a demonic choir. "You see what the artist saw, what drove him to create these visions, the truth behind the stories, the reality behind the faith." Marco tried to dismiss these dreams as the product of spending too many hours staring at disturbing imagery, but they became increasingly difficult to distinguish from waking life. Sometimes he would find himself having conversations with the painted figures while he worked, responding to words he could have sworn he heard them speak. The breakthrough came when he discovered a signature hidden in one of the frescoes, concealed within the folds of an angel's robe. The name was Giacomo il Maledetto, James the Cursed. Marco had never heard of any artist by that name, which was unusual given his extensive knowledge of Renaissance art. When he researched the name in the Vatican library, he found only a single reference in a 16th century manuscript that described a painter of great skill who was excommunicated for heretical works that drove men to madness. The more Marco learned about Giacomo, the more disturbed he became. According to the few historical records that survived, Giacomo had been commissioned by a forgotten pope to create religious artwork for a private chapel. The paintings were said to be so beautiful that they moved viewers to religious ecstasy, but also so disturbing that several priests who viewed them lost their faith entirely and fled the church. One document described how Giacomo claimed his inspiration came not from divine revelation, but from dreams in which he visited hell and conversed with demons who revealed to him the true nature of God's plan. The artist allegedly said that his paintings showed not what the church taught, but what he had been shown by entities that existed before God created the world. As Marco delved deeper into the restoration work, he began to understand what Giacomo meant. The frescoes told a story that paralleled the Bible, but with crucial differences that suggested a radically different interpretation of Christian mythology. In Giacomo's version, the serpent in Eden was not a tempter but a liberator, offering humans knowledge that God wanted to keep hidden. The angels were not divine messengers but prison guards, ensuring that humanity remained ignorant of their true nature and potential. The final fresco, located on the domed ceiling above the chamber, was the most disturbing of all. It depicted the second coming of Christ, but in this version, The returning Jesus was revealed to be identical to the serpent from Eden, the same face, the same eyes filled with forbidden knowledge. Around this figure, the dead were rising not to be judged but to be freed from the illusion of divine authority. As Marco worked on restoring this central fresco, he began to experience episodes that could only be described as visions. While standing on the scaffolding, paint and brushes in hand, he would suddenly find himself transported to the scenes he was restoring. He walked through the twisted Garden of Eden, spoke with the many-eyed angels, and witnessed the crucifixion from perspectives that no human should be able to see. During these visions, Giacomo himself appeared to Marco as clearly as if he were standing in the room. The long-dead artist was tall and gaunt, with eyes that held the same terrible knowledge depicted in his paintings. His clothes were those of a Renaissance painter, but they hung on his frame like grave clothes, and his skin had the pale, translucent quality of something that had been dead for centuries. "You understand now," Giacomo said during one of these encounters. "You see why they walled up my work, why they tried to hide the truth I discovered. But truth cannot be destroyed, only concealed. Each person who looks upon these walls sees a little more clearly." "What truth?" Marco asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. "That everything they taught you about God, about heaven and hell, about the nature of existence itself, it's all backwards," Giacomo replied. "What they call God is the jailer. What they call the devil is the liberator. The church has spent 2,000 years worshiping their own oppression and teaching others to do the same." Marco wanted to reject these words, to maintain his faith and his sanity, but the evidence was literally surrounding him. The frescoes showed a consistent alternative narrative that was internally coherent and, in its way, more logical than traditional Christian theology. If Giacomo was right, then the entire foundation of Western civilization was built on a lie. As the restoration neared completion, Marco noticed physical changes in himself. His reflection in mirrors seemed somehow different, as if he were seeing himself from angles that shouldn't be possible. His shadow appeared to move independently of his body, and sometimes he caught glimpses of additional limbs or appendages that weren't there when he looked directly. The Vatican officials, who occasionally checked on his progress, commented that he looked unwell, that he had lost weight, and developed a haunted expression. They suggested he take some time off, but Marco refused. He was obsessed with completing the work, driven by a compulsion he couldn't explain or resist. On the final night of restoration, as Marco applied the last touches to the ceiling fresco, something extraordinary happened. The painted figures began to move not just in his peripheral vision but directly in front of his eyes. The serpent-faced angels turned their heads to look at him. The twisted trees in Eden swayed as if blown by an otherworldly wind, and the Christ serpent figure on the ceiling opened its eyes and smiled. "Welcome, brother," the painted Christ said, its voice echoing from every surface in the chamber. "You have seen the truth, and the truth has made you free. But freedom comes with responsibility." Marco felt his consciousness expanding, his perception breaking free from the limitations that had bound it all his life. He could see beyond the physical world into dimensions of reality that human minds weren't designed to comprehend. The knowledge was overwhelming and transformative, but it came with a price. When Vatican security found Marco the next morning, he was standing in the center of the chamber, staring up at the ceiling fresco with an expression of transcendent joy and absolute terror. He was alive but completely unresponsive, as if his consciousness had simply departed his body. His eyes reflected the same terrible knowledge depicted in Giacomo's paintings. The restored frescoes were once again walled up immediately, and all records of the restoration project were classified at the highest levels of Vatican security. Marco was quietly committed to a private psychiatric facility, where he remained for the rest of his life, painting obsessively but never speaking another word. The paintings he created during his confinement were said to be masterpieces of technical skill, but they were so disturbing that even the most hardened art critics couldn't bear to look at them for extended periods. They depicted scenes similar to Giacomo's frescoes, but updated for the modern world, showing contemporary figures undergoing the same terrible revelations that had consumed both artists. Marco died in 1995, found in his studio surrounded by his final painting, a perfect replica of the hidden chamber's ceiling fresco, complete in every detail despite the fact that he had worked from memory alone. The painting was destroyed immediately after his death, but not before several people who viewed it reported having the same types of visions and revelations that had claimed both Marco and Giacomo. The chamber remains sealed to this day, its location known only to a handful of Vatican officials. But sometimes, maintenance workers report hearing sounds from behind the walls of the Apostolic Palacethi, sound of brushes on canvas, of an artist at work on masterpieces that no living person should ever be allowed to see. The Vatican's art collection contains some of the most beautiful and inspiring religious artwork ever created. But hidden beneath the surface, walled away from public view, are works that tell a very different story about the nature of faith, knowledge, and the price of seeking truth in places where truth was never meant to be found. Cardinal Giuseppe Martelli had heard thousands of confessions during his 40-year career in the Church, but nothing had prepared him for what he would experience in the confessional booth of the Chapel of the Blessed Sacrament during the winter of 2003. At 68, he was one of the most respected members of the College of Cardinals, known for his wisdom, his discretion, and his unwavering dedication to the Church's teachings. What happened to him in those dark December nights would shatter everything he believed about the nature of good, evil, and the institution he had devoted his life to serving. The trouble began when Cardinal Martelli volunteered to take over confession duties in the small chapel after the regular priest, Father Romano, suffered a nervous breakdown. The official story was that Father Romano had been overworked and needed extended rest, but Cardinal Martelli had heard disturbing rumors about his predecessor's final weeks of service. According to whispered conversations among the Vatican staff, Father Romano had become increasingly agitated and paranoid, claiming that he was hearing confessions from people who couldn't possibly be alive. Cardinal Martelli dismissed these stories as gossip born from the high-stress environment of Vatican life. He was a practical man, grounded in doctrine and skeptical of supernatural explanations for earthly problems. When he took over the confession duties, he expected to deal with the usual catalog of human sins: adultery, theft, lies, pride, and the occasional more serious transgression that required careful spiritual guidance. The Chapel of the Blessed Sacrament was one of the smaller worship spaces within St. Peter's Basilica, often overlooked by tourists in favor of the more famous attractions. The confessional booth itself was ancient, carved from dark wood that had absorbed centuries of whispered sins and absolutions. The booth was cramped and poorly lit, with only a small lamp to provide illumination for reading prayers and recording particularly serious confessions in the discretionary log that the Church maintained for canonical purposes. Cardinal Martelli's first indication that something was amiss came during his third night of service. A penitent entered the booth around 11 o'clock, well past the usual hours for confession, but not unprecedented for the Vatican, where people from around the world came at all hours seeking spiritual guidance. The voice that spoke to him through the wooden screen was cultured and spoke Latin with an accent he couldn't quite place. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," the voice began in the traditional manner. "It has been a very long time since my last confession." "How long, my child?" Cardinal Martelli asked, settling into the familiar rhythm of the sacrament. 537 years, came the reply. Cardinal Martelli paused, wondering if he had misheard. "I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?" 537 years, 3 months and 16 days to be precise, the voice said with disturbing clarity. "I was last absolved by Pope Sixtus IV in 1484, shortly before my death." The cardinal's first instinct was to assume he was dealing with a mentally ill person who had become confused about time and identity. Such cases were not uncommon in Vatican City, which attracted its share of individuals suffering from religious delusions. But something about the voice's calm certainty, its precise diction, made him hesitate. "Tell me about your sins, my child," he said carefully, following protocol while trying to assess the penitent's mental state. What followed was the most detailed and historically accurate confession Cardinal Martelli had ever heard. The voice described sins committed during the Renaissance papacy of Sixtus IV with a level of specificity that would have required extensive historical research to fabricate. The penitent spoke of corruption within the papal court, of murders committed for political advancement, of rituals performed in the deepest vaults of the Vatican that had nothing to do with Christian worship. "I served Pope Sixtus as his confessor," the voice explained. "But I was more than that. I was his guide into knowledge that the Church has always possessed but never acknowledged. I showed him how to harness powers that exist beyond the material world, how to ensure that the Church would survive and thrive, regardless of the spiritual worthiness of its leaders." Cardinal Martelli found himself leaning forward, drawn into the narrative despite his growing unease. The voice described Renaissance Vatican politics with an insider's knowledge, mentioning names and events that even he, with his extensive education in church history, had to think carefully to recall. "The sins I committed were not against God," the voice continued, "but against the natural order of life and death. I traded my eternal rest for the promise that I could continue to serve the Church beyond the grave. I became something that should not exist, a guardian of secrets too dangerous for the living." "What kind of secrets?" Cardinal Martelli asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. "The real history of Christianity," the voice replied. "What actually happened when Constantine converted the empire? What the Crusaders really found in Jerusalem? What bargains were made with powers older than Christ himself to ensure the Church's survival? What lives in the deepest chambers beneath St. Peter's Basilica?" As the confession continued night after night, for the voice returned every evening at the same time Cardinal Martelli began to research the historical claims being made. To his growing alarm, he found evidence supporting many of the details in Vatican documents that were supposedly secret and sealed. The voice spoke with authority about papal decisions that had never been made public, about meetings that had no official record, about individuals whose very existence was denied by church historians. The penitent claimed to have been present at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, where the canonical books of the Bible were selected. According to the voice, the decision about which texts to include and which to suppress was not based solely on theological considerations, but on the need to hide certain truths about the nature of Christ and his teachings. The Gnostic Gospels were suppressed not because they were heretical, the voice explained during one session, but because they contained accurate accounts of Christ's actual teachings about the nature of reality. Jesus taught his disciples that the material world was a prison, that the God of the Old Testament was a false deity, and that true salvation came through gnosis, direct knowledge of the divine spark within each person. Cardinal Martelli wanted to reject these claims as blasphemy, but the voice backed up every assertion with specific historical details and references to documents that the cardinal had never heard of, but which, when he investigated, turned out to exist in the deepest archives of the Vatican Library. As weeks passed, the nightly confessions began to affect Cardinal Martelli's daily life. He found himself questioning beliefs he had held since childhood, examining familiar passages of Scripture with new eyes, and noticing inconsistencies in church doctrine that had never troubled him before. His sleep became fitful, filled with dreams of underground chambers where robed figures performed rituals by candlelight, chanting in languages that predated Christianity. The voice seemed to sense his growing uncertainty and began to offer him opportunities to see the truth firsthand. "Come to the deep archives after midnight tomorrow," the voice suggested during one confession. "Gate 47 in the lowest sublevel will be unlocked. You'll find documents there that will answer the questions that are troubling you." Cardinal Martelli knew he should ignore the suggestion, should report the strange confessions to his superiors, and request to be relieved of his duties. But his scholarly curiosity and his growing need to understand the truth overrode his caution. That night, he made his way to the deepest levels of the Vatican archives, levels he had never known existed. Gate 47 was indeed unlocked, though it should have required special authorization to open. Beyond it lay a chamber filled with documents and artifacts that predated Christianity by millennia. Ancient tablets covered in cuneiform writing sat alongside medieval grimoires bound in what looked suspiciously like human skin. At the center of the chamber was a stone altar that bore symbols he recognized from his nightmares. As he examined these forbidden materials, Cardinal Martelli began to understand the scope of what the voice had been telling him. The Church had not simply grown from the teachings of Jesus Christ, but had been built on foundations that were far older and far more complex than official history acknowledged. Christianity had absorbed and adapted elements from mystery religions, magical traditions, and cults that worshipped beings that existed before the God of Abraham. "Now you begin to see," came a familiar voice from behind him. Cardinal Martelli turned to find a figure in ecclesiastical robes standing in the shadows of the chamber. The man appeared to be in his 50s, with the pale complexion and gaunt features of someone who spent little time in sunlight. His clothing was of a style that hadn't been worn in centuries, but it appeared perfectly preserved. "You're the one who's been coming to confession," Cardinal Martelli said, though it wasn't really a question. "I am Cardinal Alessandro Farnese," the figure replied, though I held that title when it meant something rather different than it does now. "I served Pope Sixtus IV faithfully until my death in 1484, and I have continued to serve the Church in ways that the living cannot." Cardinal Martelli recognized the name from his historical research. Alessandro Farnese had been one of Sixtus IV's most trusted advisors, instrumental in the political and religious reforms that had strengthened papal power during the Renaissance. According to official records, he had died of fever, but standing before Cardinal Martelli was a man who appeared very much alive, if deeply changed by his centuries of unnatural existence. "What are you?" Cardinal Martelli whispered. "I am what the Church creates when it needs servants who can work beyond the constraints of mortal life," Farnese replied. "There are dozens of us throughout Vatican history, cardinals, bishops, even popes who have made bargains with powers older than Christianity to ensure the Church's survival. We are the real guardians of Catholic doctrine, the ones who make the difficult decisions that preserve the faith even when those decisions would horrify the faithful." Farnese led Cardinal Martelli deeper into the hidden chambers beneath the Vatican, showing him rooms filled with artifacts that told the true story of Christian history. Ancient scrolls described how the early Church had made alliances with pre-Christian deities in order to convert pagan populations. Medieval documents detailed how popes had used methods borrowed from witchcraft and demon worship to maintain their temporal power. Renaissance accounts revealed how church leaders had participated in rituals that would be considered satanic by modern standards. But why? Cardinal Martelli asked, his faith crumbling as he absorbed the evidence surrounding him. Why preserve the Church if it's built on such foundations? Because the alternative is worse, Farnese replied. The Church, for all its dark secrets and necessary compromises, has prevented something far more terrible from taking hold in the world. There are powers that existed before God created light, beings that feed on human suffering and despair. Christianity, even corrupted Christianity, provides a barrier against these entities. Every prayer, every act of faith, every moment of genuine spiritual devotion strengthens that barrier. The confessions you've been making, Cardinal Martelli realized, they're not really confessions at all. You're trying to recruit me. The Church needs servants who understand the true nature of its mission, Farnese confirmed. You have the knowledge, the position, and the flexibility of mind necessary to serve as I have served. The choice is yours, but understand that you cannot unknow what you have learned. You can either help us maintain the necessary balance, or you can be silenced to protect the greater good. Cardinal Martelli spent 3 days in the hidden chambers, reading documents and examining artifacts that revealed the true scope of the Church's hidden history. He learned about popes who had been possessed by ancient spirits, about saints whose miracles had been accomplished through methods that had nothing to do with divine intervention, about crusades that had been launched not to reclaim holy sites but to retrieve artifacts of pre-Christian power. The weight of this knowledge was overwhelming. Everything he had believed about his faith, his vocation, and his purpose in life had been revealed as a beautiful lie, constructed to hide a more complex and disturbing truth. Yet, as Farnese had pointed out, The alternative to the Church's compromised existence was potentially far worse. On the fourth day, Cardinal Martelli made his choice. When he returned to his regular duties, he appeared to others as unchanged, continuing his work with the same dedication and wisdom that had always characterized his service. But those closest to him noticed subtle differences. His homilies took on a darker tone, speaking more often of the constant struggle between light and darkness, of the need for vigilance against forces that most people couldn't imagine. His approach to confession became more probing, as if he were assessing each penitent for their potential to handle difficult truths. Late at night, he could be seen walking through the deepest corridors of the Vatican, carrying keys that opened doors most people didn't know existed. He became a keeper of secrets, a guardian of knowledge that could not be shared with the faithful without destroying their faith entirely. Cardinal Martelli continued in his duties until his official death in 2011, when he was found in his chambers having apparently died peacefully in his sleep. The funeral was attended by thousands, and he was remembered as a faithful servant of the Church, whose wisdom and guidance had touched countless lives. But sometimes, late at night in the chapel of the Blessed Sacrament, visitors report hearing voices from the confessional booth, two voices engaged in quiet conversation, discussing matters of faith, history, and the prices that must be paid to preserve both truth and necessary illusion in a world that might not be able to survive either in their pure form. The Church continues its mission of providing spiritual guidance and comfort to billions of believers around the world. But beneath the surface, in chambers that exist outside official acknowledgement, other servants continue their work of maintaining balances that most minds could not comprehend and protecting secrets that might be too dangerous for the light of day. In the end, perhaps the most terrifying aspect of these Vatican horror stories is not that they might be true, but that they might be necessary, that some truths are so dangerous that they require guardians who are willing to sacrifice their own souls to keep them hidden from a world that might not survive their revelation. Father Alessandro Benedetti had always believed that knowledge was sacred, but after 17 years as the head archivist of the Vatican Secret Archives, he understood that some knowledge was sacred, precisely because it was meant to remain hidden. It began on a Tuesday in November, when the autumn rain drummed against the ancient windows of the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum. Alessandro was cataloging a recently discovered collection of 14th century manuscripts when he noticed an inconsistency in the filing system. Shelf 847C contained only 37 documents, yet the catalog indicated 38 items should be housed there. Alessandro prided himself on meticulous record-keeping. In nearly 2 decades of service, he had never encountered such a discrepancy. He spent the remainder of the day cross-referencing inventories, but the missing document cataloged simply as Manuscript 847 C38, Personal Account 1348, appeared to have vanished without explanation. That night, Alessandro remained in the archives long after the other staff had departed. The vast underground chambers, normally filled with the quiet shuffle of researchers and the soft whisper of turning pages, now echoed with an unsettling emptiness. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows between the towering shelves that stretched into darkness. As he searched a restricted section accessible only to senior archivists, Alessandro discovered something peculiar. Behind a row of bound papal bulls from the 15th century, his fingers encountered a gap in the stone wall, a hidden compartment barely large enough to accommodate a single document. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was the missing manuscript. The parchment was yellowed with age, its edges brittle and cracking. Written in medieval Latin, the text bore the heading, "The True Account of Brother Matteo of Assisi, being his final confession before the merciful God." The date indicated it was written during the height of the Black Death that ravaged Europe in the mid-14th century. Alessandro's Latin was impeccable, honed by years of theological study. As he began to translate Brother Matteo's account, the temperature in the archive seemed to drop several degrees. I, Brother Matteo of Assisi, do set down this account in the year of our Lord 1348, knowing that I shall not see another dawn. The plague that devastates Christendom is not what the learned doctors proclaim. It is not born of corrupted air or sinful living, but of something far more ancient and terrible. 3 months passed. His Holiness Pope Clement VI commanded me to join an expedition to the catacombs beneath Rome, following reports of strange disturbances from local clergy. We were 7 in total: myself, 2 other Franciscan brothers, a Dominican scholar, and 3 Swiss guards. The entrance lay hidden beneath the church of San Lorenzo, behind a wall that had been sealed since the time of Constantine. Our torches revealed corridors carved from living rock, their walls adorned with symbols that predated Christian Rome. The air grew thick as we descended, carrying a scent like copper and myrrh. Brother Francesco, youngest among us, remarked that the symbols resembled those he had studied in forbidden texts from Alexandria. Father Johannes, the Dominican, commanded him to speak no more of such things, but I saw fear in the older priest's eyes. We discovered chambers filled with artifacts that should not exist, stone tablets covered in script that hurt the eyes to read, vessels crafted from metals unknown to Christian smiths, and at the deepest level, a sealed doorway marked with warnings in Latin, Greek, and languages that no living tongue could speak. Captain Heinrich of the guard argued for retreat, but Father Johannes insisted we had divine mandate. Against all wisdom, we broke the ancient seals. What emerged cannot be described in words that God intended for Christian mouths. It was darkness given form, hunger made manifest. It spoke in voices of the damned, promising knowledge that would elevate man to divine status. Brother Francesco stepped forward, entranced, and it touched him. The transformation was immediate and terrible. His flesh became as parchment, his eyes like burning coals. He spoke in tongues unknown, revealing secrets that should remain forever hidden. The guards tried to restrain him, but he moved with inhuman strength, killing Captain Heinrich with bare hands before disappearing into the shadows of the catacombs. We fled, sealing the entrance as best we could, but it was too late. The entity had tasted freedom, and through Brother Francesco, it began its work. Within a week, a strange sickness appeared in Rome. Not the familiar plague we knew, but something that killed in ways that defied natural law. The dead rose briefly before falling again, speaking prophecies that drove men mad. The living developed marks upon their flesh-black boils that formed patterns resembling the symbols we had seen below. I have watched it spread across Italy, carried by those who were touched by the entity's influence. What the world calls the Black Death is merely the shadow of something far more sinister. The true plague is not of the body but of the soul, and it will continue until the entity has claimed what it seeks. I write this in the papal palace itself, where even now the Holy Father lies dying, his flesh marked with those terrible symbols. He whispers secrets in languages that predate Babel, and his eyes burn with the same fire I saw in Brother Francesco. God forgive us. We thought we served his divine will, but we have unleashed something that existed before Christ walked among men. The entity desires not mere death but the corruption of faith itself. It feeds on the despair of the faithful, growing stronger with each soul that questions God's mercy in the face of seemingly random death. I have hidden this account where it may be found by those who come after, pray they possess wisdom we lack. The true entrance to the entity's domain lies not beneath San Lorenzo, but somewhere deeper, in chambers that connect to the very foundations of St. Peter's itself. Seek the mark of the twisted cross in the oldest stones. The plague will pass, as all earthly trials must, but the entity remains. It waits below, patient as stone, feeding on the accumulated fear and doubt of centuries. When faith grows weak and men's hearts turn from God, it will rise again. I go now to join my brothers in death, hoping that the Almighty's mercy extends even to fools who open doors that should remain forever sealed. May this account serve as warning to any who find it. Some knowledge is too terrible for mortal minds, and some doors once opened can never truly be closed. Brother Matteo of Assisi, in the year of our Lord 1348, the 32nd year of his life, the final hour of his service. Alessandro's hands trembled as he finished reading. The manuscript felt heavier than it should, as if the words themselves possessed weight. Around him, the archive seemed to hold its breath, the familiar sounds of settling stone and humming electricity replaced by an oppressive silence. He looked at his watch. 2:47 a.m. He had been reading for over 6 hours without realizing the passage of time. As he carefully rewrapped the manuscript, Alessandro noticed something that made his blood freeze. In the margin of the final page, written in different ink and a more modern hand, were additional lines. The brother spoke truly. I have found the mark he described. The entity stirs once more, feeding on the doubts of our modern age. It whispers to those who work in these halls, showing them visions of truth too terrible for mortal comprehension. The old seals weaken with each passing year. Cardinal Francesco Borgia, 1503. Below that, in yet another hand, Borgia was weak. The entity offers knowledge that could revolutionize our understanding of divine law. I will seek the deeper chambers. The Church must evolve or perish. Archbishop Antonio Marcello, 1789. The final entry was written in a hand Alessandro recognized the precise script taught in modern seminaries. Marcello was never seen again, but his research notes remain hidden in section 847D. The entity grows stronger. The old protections fail. Someone must take action before it achieves its goal. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, 1981. Alessandro's breath caught. Cardinal Ratzinger, man who later became Pope Benedict XVI. With shaking hands, he turned the page and found one final entry, written in ink that still looked wet. The time approaches. The entity has shown me what lies beneath St. Peter's throne. The foundations are not what they seem. Tonight I go to complete what centuries of faithful servants could not accomplish. I will find a way to strengthen the seals, or die in the attempt. Cardinal Alessandro Benedetti, 2023. Alessandro stared at the page in horror. The handwriting was unmistakably his own, though he had no memory of writing these words. His name, his title, the current year, all in his precise script. The lights in the archive began to flicker. In the distance, barely audible, came the sound of footsteps on stone. They seemed to be coming from beneath the floor, growing closer with each passing second. Alessandro felt compelled to stand, to walk deeper into the archives. His feet moved without conscious direction, carrying him toward section 847D, where Archbishop Marcello's research supposedly lay hidden. Each step felt inevitable, as if he were following a path laid out long ago. In the deepest part of the archives, where even the senior staff rarely ventured, Alessandro found himself standing before a wall that seemed somehow different from the others. Running his fingers along the ancient stones, he discovered what Brother Matteo had described, a twisted cross carved so subtly into the rock that it was nearly invisible. When he pressed against the symbol, a section of the wall swung inward with surprising ease, revealing a narrow staircase descending into absolute darkness. The air that wafted up carried that same scent Brother Matteo had described, copper and myrrh, with an underlying note of something organic and rotting. Alessandro found himself descending without conscious decision, his phone's flashlight barely penetrating the gloom. The walls were covered with the same symbols Brother Matteo had mentioned, though Alessandro couldn't bring himself to look at them directly. They seemed to writhe and shift in his peripheral vision, forming patterns that his mind refused to process. The staircase ended in a vast chamber that extended far beyond the reach of his light. In the center stood a stone altar covered in artifacts that seemed to absorb rather than reflect illumination. And there, standing with his back to the entrance, was a figure in cardinal's robes. "You're late," the figure said without turning around. The voice was familiar yet wrong, as if heard through water. "I've been waiting since 1789. The figure turned, and Alessandro saw the face of Archbishop Marcello, exactly as depicted in the portrait hanging in the papal palace. But the eyes were wrong. They burned with that same terrible fire Brother Matteo had described. The entity has been patient, Marcello continued, his voice carrying harmonics that made Alessandro's bones ache, feeding slowly, carefully. Each generation provides a few faithful servants, drawn by the promise of ultimate knowledge. You understand, don't you, Alessandro? You've always known there were answers the church couldn't provide. Alessandro tried to speak, to pray, but found his voice had abandoned him. Around the chamber, he could see other figures now in robes from different centuries, all standing motionless, all with those same burning eyes. We are the true guardians of faith, Marcello said, approaching with fluid, inhuman grace. We preserve the knowledge that weak minds cannot comprehend. The entity doesn't seek to destroy the church, it seeks to perfect it, to strip away the comfortable lies and reveal the magnificent, terrible truth that lies at the heart of creation. Alessandro's phone slipped from his nerveless fingers, its light spinning wildly as it clattered across the stone floor before going dark. In the absolute blackness, he heard movement all around him, the shuffle of feet, the whisper of ancient robes, and underneath it all, a sound like vast wings unfolding. "Welcome, Brother Alessandro," said a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once, speaking in languages that predated human speech, yet somehow remained perfectly comprehensible. "We have been waiting so very long for you to find your way home." The next morning, the Vatican archives opened as usual. Alessandro's assistant, Father Marco, noted that the head archivist had apparently worked through the night. Again, his office showed signs of recent occupancy, and several files from section 847 lay open on his desk. Alessandro himself was nowhere to be found. A brief search revealed his car still in the parking garage and his personal effects still in his office. The Vatican Swiss Guard conducted a thorough investigation, but Father Alessandro Benedetti had simply vanished. Father Marco was promoted to head archivist within the month. During his first week in the position, he discovered a filing discrepancy. Manuscript 847, C38, had somehow returned to its proper place, though he distinctly remembered Alessandro mentioning it was missing. Curious, Father Marco examined the document. It was Brother Matteo's confession, exactly as catalogued, with one small addition. On the final page, below Cardinal Ratzinger's entry, someone had added a new note in precise, familiar handwriting. "The seals are strengthened. The entity sleeps once more, but only for a time. The faithful must remain vigilant. The true guardians watch from below, protecting the church from knowledge it is not yet ready to bear." Father Alessandro Benedetti, Guardian of the Deep Archive, 2023. Father Marco stared at the entry for a long time. Then, carefully, he closed the manuscript and returned it to its proper place on the shelf. He never mentioned the addition to anyone, though sometimes, late at night when working alone in the archives, he could swear he heard footsteps in the depths below, measured, patient, eternal. The Vatican Secret Archives continued their work, preserving the accumulated knowledge of 2 millennia of faith. But in the deepest chambers, where even the most senior archivists rarely ventured, new guardians kept their silent vigil, protecting the church from truths too terrible for mortal comprehension. And in the darkness below St. Peter's throne, something ancient and patient continued to wait, fed by the doubts and fears of the faithful, growing stronger with each passing generation, biding its time until the seals would weaken once again. The church endured, as it always had, but now it was protected by guardians who had paid the ultimate price for knowledge and who would continue to pay that price for as long as faith and doubt warred in the human heart. Cardinal Michael O'Sullivan had heard confessions for 43 years, but nothing had prepared him for what walked into St. Peter's Basilica on that gray December morning. The woman appeared unremarkable, at first glance middle-aged, modestly dressed, carrying herself with the quiet dignity common among the faithful who traveled great distances to reach the Vatican. She knelt in the pew outside his confessional booth, at precisely 9:15 a.m., clasping rosary beads that seemed unusually dark against her pale fingers. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," she began in accented English when she finally entered the booth. Her voice carried the weight of exhaustion, as if she had not slept in weeks. It has been 673 years since my last confession." Cardinal O'Sullivan paused. In his decades of service, he had heard every conceivable opening to a confession, from the mundane to the bizarre. But this was new. "My child," he said gently, "perhaps you meant 673 days." "No, Father." Her voice was steady, resigned. "I mean exactly what I said. My name was once Sister Margarita de Cortona. I took my vows in the year of our Lord 1349, during the great pestilence that swept across Europe. I have been walking this earth for nearly 7 centuries, and I can no longer bear the weight of what I have done." Cardinal O'Sullivan settled back in his chair, preparing for what was clearly going to be a lengthy delusion. He had encountered individuals suffering from various forms of religious psychosis before, people who believed they were biblical figures, saints, or in some cases, much older than humanly possible. "Tell me what troubles you, my child," he said, falling back on the gentle patience that had served him well in similar situations. "I must begin at the beginning," she said, "though the beginning is not what you might expect. I was born Margherita Salvucci in the hill town of Cortona in the year 1332. The world was different, then smaller, more dangerous, but also more certain in its faith. When the Great Dying came in 1348, I was 16 years old and novice in the convent of Santa Chiara." Her voice took on the cadence of memory, detailed and specific in ways that impressed Cardinal O'Sullivan despite himself. She spoke of people and places with the intimacy of personal experience, describing life in medieval Italy with an accuracy that would have impressed scholars. "The plague came to Cortona in late summer," she continued. "First the rats died, then the poor in the lower town. Then it began climbing the hill like a living thing, claiming rich and poor alike. Our convent became a hospital, then a morgue, then merely a place where the dying came to wait for God's mercy." She described the symptoms with clinical precision: the swollen buboes, the blackening flesh, the delirium that preceded death. But it was her account of the human cost that made Cardinal O'Sullivan lean forward despite himself. "Sister Elena died on a Tuesday, Sister Francesca on the Wednesday following. Mother Superior lasted until Friday, though she was speaking to angels for 2 days before the end. By the feast of St. Francis, only 3 of us remained: myself, Sister Benedetta, and little Agnese, who was only 14 and still learning her prayers." The woman's breathing had grown shallow, as if the memory itself was physically taxing. "That night, as we tended to the last of the townspeople who had sought sanctuary with us, a stranger came to our gates. He wore the habit of a Dominican friar, but there was something wrong about him. His skin was too pale, his eyes too bright, and when he spoke, his words seemed to echo strangely in the night air." Cardinal O'Sullivan found himself drawn into the narrative despite his skepticism. The woman's voice had taken on a hypnotic quality, and the details she provided were remarkably consistent and vivid. "The friar told us he had come from Rome, carrying a message from Pope Clement VI himself. The Holy Father had received a revelation, he said, a divine vision that revealed how the faithful might be preserved from the pestilence, but it required a sacrifice, freely given by pure souls." Here the woman's voice broke, and Cardinal O'Sullivan could hear her weeping softly in the darkness of the confessional. "We were so young, Father, so naive in our faith. When he explained what was required of us, we didn't question. We thought we were serving God's will." "What did he ask of you?" Cardinal O'Sullivan found himself asking, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "A ritual," she whispered, "ancient words in a language that predated Latin. We were to shed our blood upon an altar hidden beneath the convent, while reciting prayers he claimed were given directly to Moses but hidden from common believers. He said our sacrifice would create a barrier around Cortona, protecting the remaining faithful from the plague." The woman's voice grew stronger, but also more haunted. Sister Benedetta went first. She was always the most devout among us. The friar cut her palms with a knife that seemed to be made of black stone, and her blood fell upon symbols carved into the altar's surface. But instead of crying out in pain, she began to laugh, a horrible, inhuman sound that echoed through the underground chamber. Cardinal O'Sullivan felt a chill run down his spine. The woman's description was becoming increasingly disturbing, but her voice carried the ring of absolute conviction. When her blood touched the altar, Sister Benedetta changed. Her flesh became like marble, cold and smooth, and her eyes turned the color of midnight sky. She spoke in voices that weren't her own, revealing secrets about the townspeople that no one should have known. The friar smiled and said the ritual was working perfectly. Little Agnese was next. She was so frightened, but the friar assured her that her sacrifice would save hundreds of souls. When her blood joined Benedetta's, the transformation was even more pronounced. Her hair turned white as snow, and when she moved, she seemed to flow rather than walk. But the most terrible change was in her voice. It became beautiful beyond description, so lovely that it hurt to hear. Cardinal O'Sullivan realized his hands were gripping his chair. "And then it was your turn," he said quietly. "Yes," the word came out as barely a whisper. "I approached the altar willingly, believing I was about to join the ranks of martyrs." The friar raised his knife, and I offered my hands to receive the sacred wounds. But as the blade touched my skin, I suddenly understood what we had truly done. The altar wasn't Christian at all. The symbols carved into its surface were much older than Christ, older than Rome itself. And the friar, Father, the friar was not what he appeared to be. In the moment my blood touched that accursed stone, I saw him as he truly was, something that had walked the earth since before man learned to speak. Something that fed on human faith and perverted it for its own purposes. The woman's voice took on a note of desperate urgency, but it was too late. The ritual was complete, and we three had become something between the living and the dead. The entity for that is what the false friar truly was explained our new purpose. We were to be its servants, spreading a different kind of plague. Not one that killed the body, but one that corrupted the soul. Cardinal O'Sullivan found himself struggling to maintain his pastoral composure. The woman's account was clearly delusional, but it was delivered with such conviction and disturbing detail that it was affecting him more than it should have. For nearly 7 centuries, Father, I have walked among the faithful, carrying out the entity's commands. I appear to priests, to bishops, to humble believers, always in moments of crisis or doubt. I offer them visions, revelations, secrets that seem to come from God Himself. But every truth I share is poisoned. Every miracle I perform serves to corrupt rather than uplift. She began to sob again, the sound echoing in the small confessional. I have been present at the election of 17 popes, whispering suggestions that seemed divinely inspired, but ultimately led the Church toward darkness. I was in the shadows when the Inquisition turned from protection to persecution. I walked the halls of power when the Church split and wars were fought in Christ's name. Every few decades, I return here, to St. Peter's itself, to deliver messages that appear to come from heaven, but actually originate from something far older and infinitely more patient. The entity has been slowly, carefully guiding the Church toward a moment of ultimate revelation time, when all the accumulated secrets and sins will be revealed, and humanity's faith will shatter like glass. Cardinal O'Sullivan found his voice. If what you're telling me is true, and I'm not saying I believe it, why are you confessing now? What's changed? Because the moment approaches, she said, her voice filled with terror and determination. The entity has spent 7 centuries corrupting the Church from within, planting seeds of doubt and division that are now ready to bloom. There is to be a great revelation. Father, secrets will be unveiled that will rock the foundations of faith itself. And I have finally found the strength to resist. After all these centuries, I choose to defy the entity that created me, even knowing that my defiance will cost me everything I have left of existence. Cardinal O'Sullivan leaned forward. What secrets? What revelation? Tomorrow night, she whispered, during the Christmas Eve Mass, Pope Francis will receive what appears to be a divine vision. He will believe he is being commanded by God to reveal the true contents of the third secret of Fatima, not the sanitized version released by previous popes, but the complete, unedited prophecy that has been hidden in the Vatican secret archives for over a century. Cardinal O'Sullivan's blood ran cold. He was one of the few Vatican officials who knew that the third secret released in 2000 was indeed incomplete, that certain portions had been deemed too disturbing for public revelation. The complete secret contains details about the corruption within the church hierarchy, specific names and dates of scandals yet to be revealed, and prophecies about the ultimate fate of organized religion. When revealed in its entirety, it will destroy the faith of millions and plunge the world into spiritual chaos. But that's not the worst part, Father. The entity has ensured that the revelation will be accompanied by seemingly miraculous sign-sweeping statues, stigmata appearing on the faithful voices from heaven that will seem to confirm every terrible word. The faithful will believe they are witnessing the end times, not realizing they are seeing the culmination of a plan that began in the 14th century. Cardinal O'Sullivan found himself believing her despite every rational instinct. What do you want from me? What can I do? The entity draws its power from the corrupted faith of its servants, she said urgently. For 7 centuries, Sister Benedetta, little Agnes, and I have provided that power willingly or unwillingly. But if one of us can find the strength to truly repent, to reject the false gifts we were given, it may weaken the entity enough to prevent tomorrow night's revelation. I have chosen to be that one, Father. I offer you my confession not just of my actions, but of my very existence. If you can find the grace to grant me absolution, if you can help me die as the human being I once was rather than the monster I became, it may be enough to save countless souls. Cardinal O'Sullivan sat in stunned silence for several long moments. Everything she had told him was insane, impossible, the ravings of a deeply disturbed mind. And yet, how? He asked quietly. How can I help you accomplish this? The ritual that created us can be reversed, but only by a priest of sufficient authority and genuine faith. It requires the Eucharist note, the bread and wine used in normal communion, but elements that have been consecrated by someone with the spiritual power to command heaven itself. And then I will finally die, Father. My body will turn to dust, as it should have 7 centuries ago, and my soul will face whatever judgment awaits those who have served darkness while believing they served the light. Cardinal O'Sullivan closed his eyes and prayed silently for guidance. When he opened them again, he had made his decision. I will need some time to prepare, he said. Can you meet me tonight in the Sistine Chapel? Midnight? Yes, she breathed, relief evident in her voice. But Father, know that the entity will not let me go easily. It will try to stop us, and it has servants throughout the Vatican who may not even know they are being manipulated. Trust no one completely, and if I don't appear at midnight, assume I have been prevented from coming. What if this is all an elaborate deception? Cardinal O'Sullivan asked. What if you are not what you claim to be? Then you will have wasted one night attempting to save a soul that may not be worth saving, she replied. But if I am telling the truth and you do nothing, tomorrow the world will witness the beginning of the end of faith as we know it. The confessional booth creaked as she stood to leave. Pray for me, Father. Pray for all of us who have served in darkness while believing we walked in the light. Cardinal O'Sullivan sat alone in the booth for a long time after she left, wrestling with the impossible decision he faced. Finally, he emerged and walked slowly through the basilica, noting details he had never paid attention to before: the play of light and shadow across ancient stones, the faces of saints carved in marble, the sense of accumulated prayer and devotion that had soaked into the very walls over the centuries. That evening, he prepared with the solemnity of a man about to perform either the most important act of his ministry or the most foolish. He consecrated the elements himself, using prayers that had been reserved for only the most sacred occasions. He also took the precaution of informing Cardinal Secretary of State Parolin about his concerns regarding Christmas Eve Mass, though he couldn't bring himself to explain his true reasons. At 11:45 p.m., Cardinal O'Sullivan entered the Sistine Chapel. The famous ceiling disappeared into shadow above him, and only a few candles illuminated the space where popes were elected and history was made. The woman was already there, kneeling before the altar. In the candlelight, she appeared somehow less substantial than she had in the confessional booth, as if she were already beginning to fade from the world. "I wasn't certain you would come," she said without turning around. "Neither was I," he admitted, approaching with the consecrated elements. "Are you ready?" "I have been ready for 700 years, she said, finally facing him. In the dim light, Cardinal O'Sullivan could see that her face was changing, growing younger, as if the weight of centuries was already beginning to lift. What followed was unlike any ceremony Cardinal O'Sullivan had ever performed. As he placed the consecrated bread on her tongue and offered her the wine, the woman began to glow with a soft, golden light. Her skin, which had appeared normal in the confessional, now showed its true age, parchment thin and translucent, revealing the outline of bones beneath. "I can see them," she whispered, her voice growing fainter. "Sister Benedetta and little Agnese. They're here, Father. They've been waiting for me to find the courage to join them." The golden light grew brighter, and Cardinal O'Sullivan had to shield his eyes. When it faded, the woman was gone. Only a small pile of dust remained on the chapel floor, along with a set of medieval rosary beads that crumbled to nothing when he touched them. Cardinal O'Sullivan spent the rest of the night in prayer, emerging only when dawn broke over the Vatican. He attended Christmas Eve Mass that evening, with a mixture of anticipation and dread, watching Pope Francis closely for any sign that he was about to make an unusual announcement. But the Mass proceeded normally. The Holy Father delivered a beautiful homily about hope and redemption, blessed the faithful, and gave no indication that he had received any visions or divine commands. The third secret of Fatima remained safely hidden in the archives. In the days that followed, Cardinal O'Sullivan researched medieval records, searching for any mention of Sister Margherita di Cortona or the convent of Santa Chiara. He found brief references in 14th century church documents records of a small community of nuns who had died during the plague, their convent abandoned and later destroyed. But in one chronicle, written by a Dominican friar who had traveled through Tuscany in 1350, he found a troubling passage. In the hill town of Cortona, the pestilence claimed all save 3 holy sisters, who were granted divine protection through a miraculous intervention. These blessed women were said to have received special graces that allowed them to minister to the faithful across many lands, though they were never seen to age or require earthly sustenance. The chronicle concluded with a note that chilled Cardinal O'Sullivan's blood. The good friar who performed this miracle was himself a man of great learning and piety, though his name was never recorded and he departed as mysteriously as he had arrived. Cardinal O'Sullivan closed the chronicle and sat back in his chair. Whether the woman's story had been truth or elaborate fantasy, her confession had accomplished something profound. It had reminded him that the battle between good and evil was not always fought on obvious battlefields, and that sometimes the most important victories were won in the simple act of offering redemption to those who believed themselves beyond saving. He never spoke publicly about that night in the Sistine Chapel, but in his private prayers he always included a petition for the soul of Sister Margherita di Cortona, and for all those who serve in darkness while seeking the light. The Vatican continued its ancient work, shepherding the faithful through an increasingly complex world. But in the deepest archives, among records of saints and sinners, miracles and mysteries, a new file was quietly created, a record of one night when a cardinal chose to believe in the possibility of redemption, even for those who had wandered furthest from grace. And sometimes, late at night when the basilica was empty save for the eternal presence of the sacred, visitors reported seeing 3 figures kneeling in prayer before the main altar, 3 women in medieval religious habits, their faces serene and their forms translucent in the candlelight, finally at peace after centuries of wandering. The Church endured, as it always had, protected not only by its living servants, but by those who had found their way back to grace after walking long in shadow, guardian souls who had learned that no sin is too great for genuine repentance, and no darkness so complete that it cannot be illuminated by divine mercy. The bells of St. Peter's Basilica had fallen silent 3 days ago when Cardinal Alessandro Torretti first noticed the shadows moving wrong in the Apostolic Palace. As the newly appointed Camerlengote cardinal responsible for the Church's temporal affairs during papal transition, she had expected sleepless nights. What he hadn't expected was the whispering that seemed to emanate from the very stones beneath his feet. It began on the evening of October 13th, 1978, just hours after the white smoke had failed to rise from the Sistine Chapel for the fourth consecutive day. The papal conclave had reached an unprecedented deadlock, with no cardinal able to secure the required two-thirds majority. Cardinal Torretti, a pragmatic man of 63 with steel-gray hair and penetrating dark eyes, had dismissed the other cardinals for the evening and was making his final rounds through the sacred corridors when he first heard it. Alessandro. The voice was barely audible, like wind through ancient stones, but it carried his name with unmistakable clarity. He stopped beneath one of Raphael's frescoes, his leather shoes echoing in the vast hallway. The palace, normally alive with the quiet bustle of priests and Vatican staff, felt unnaturally empty. Even the Swiss guards seemed to avoid certain passages, though they would never admit it. "Hello?" Cardinal Torretti called out, his voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. Nothing answered but his own echo. He had served the Church for 40 years, rising through the ranks with unwavering faith and diplomatic skill. He had counseled popes, negotiated with world leaders, and managed crises that would have broken lesser men. But nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for what was happening within these holy walls. The next morning brought no relief. During the 5th day of voting, Cardinal Torretti noticed several of his colleagues casting nervous glances at the corners of the Sistine Chapel, their faces pale and drawn. Cardinal Benetti, the eldest among them at 81, approached him during a brief recess. "Alessandro, we need to talk," the old man whispered, his hand trembling as he gripped Torretti's arm. "Last night, in my cell, I saw something." A figure in papal robes, but the face. He shuddered. The face was not of this world. Cardinal Torretti studied his colleague's weathered features. Benetti had been present at 3 previous conclaves and was known for his steady nerves and practical nature. If he was shaken, something was genuinely wrong. "What exactly did you see, Giuseppe?" "It stood at the foot of my bed, wearing the white cassock of the Holy Father. But where the face should have been, there was only shadow shifting, writhing shadow. And it spoke." Benetti's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "It said the papal throne must not remain empty. That something hungry waits in the darkness between popes, growing stronger with each passing hour." That afternoon, Cardinal Torretti made his way to the Vatican secret archives, that labyrinthine repository of the Church's most closely guarded documents. The elderly prefect, Monsignor Castellano, greeted him with obvious reluctance. "Your Eminence, surely there are more pressing matters during the conclave." "I need to see the records from 1605, Cardinal Torretti interrupted. "The conclave that lasted 27 days. Monsignor Castellano's face went white. "Your Eminence, those documents, they are sealed for good reason. The previous Camerlengo during that conclave specifically. I am the current Camerlengo, and I am ordering you to retrieve them. Now." An hour later, Cardinal Torretti sat alone in a reading chamber deep within the archives, surrounded by leather-bound volumes that smelled of age and secrets. The flickering fluorescent light seemed inadequate against the weight of centuries pressing down around him. The documents told a terrifying tale. In 1605, as the cardinal struggled to elect a successor to Pope Leo XI, who had died after only 27 days in office, strange phenomena had plagued the Vatican. Cardinals reported seeing shadowy figures roaming the halls at night. Several experienced violent nightmares of being pursued through endless corridors by something that breathed like wind through a tomb. 2 cardinals had suffered complete mental collapses and had to be removed from the conclave. Most disturbing of all was the account left by Cardinal Francesco Borghese, the Camerlengo of that conclave. His final entry, written in a shaking hand, described an encounter in the Pauline Chapel at the stroke of midnight. I was drawn there by a compulsion I could not resist, as if invisible hands guided my steps. The chapel was filled with figures, dozens of them all, wearing papal vestments from different eras. Some I recognized from portraits: Gregory VII, Innocent III, Boniface VIII. Others were older, their robes bearing styles from the earliest days of the Church. But all shared the same terrible characteristic: where their faces should have been, there was only hungry darkness. They turned toward me as one, and I understood. The papal office is more than earthly authority. It is a seal, a barrier against something that has waited since before Christ walked among us. Each pope holds back this darkness through the divine authority invested in him. But in the space between popes, during the sede vacante, the seal weakens, and if it remains vacant too long, God forgive us, we elected Paul the very next morning. But I fear we may have been too late. Something followed us out of that chapel, and I do not think it has ever truly left these walls. Cardinal Torretti set down the document with trembling hands. The fluorescent light flickered ominously, and for a moment, he could have sworn he saw movement in the shadows between the towering shelves. That night, he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of returning to his chambers, he positioned himself in the Pauline Chapel, determined to confront whatever presence was growing stronger with each passing hour of the vacant papacy. The chapel, built during the reign of Pope Paul III and decorated with Michelangelo's final frescoes, felt different in the darkness. The paintings of St. Peter's crucifixion and St. Paul's conversion seemed to move in the weak light filtering through the stained glass windows. Cardinal Torretti knelt before the altar, his rosary clutched tightly in his hands. He began to pray, but the Latin words felt heavy on his tongue, as if the air itself resisted their pronunciation. The temperature in the chapel began to drop, and his breath became visible in the suddenly frigid atmosphere. Alessandro. The voice was stronger now, no longer a whisper, but a low, resonant call that seemed to come from beneath the marble floor. Cardinal Torretti forced himself to continue praying, even as the shadows around him began to deepen and move with purposeful intent. "You understand, don't you?" the voice continued. "You've read the old records. You know what happens when the throne of St. Peter stands empty too long." The darkness in the corners of the chapel began to coalesce into shape-stall figures in papal robes, just as Cardinal Borghese had described. But as they drew closer, Cardinal Torretti realized these were not the ghosts of past popes. These were older, more primitive things wearing stolen authority like a mask. "We have waited so patiently," the central figure spoke, its voice like the wind through a charnel house, feeding on the fear, growing stronger in the spaces between. "But we hunger for more than terror. We hunger for dominion." Cardinal Torretti rose to his feet, still clutching his rosary. "You have no power here. This is holy ground, consecrated by the blood of martyrs and the prayers of saints." "Holy ground?" The thing that wore papal white began to laugh, a sound like breaking glass. "Look around you, Cardinal. Do you see any saints coming to your aid? Do you feel the presence of your God in this place?" And to his horror, Cardinal Torretti realized he could not. The chapel, which should have been suffused with divine presence, felt empty, not just vacant, but actively hollow, as if something had deliberately carved away all traces of the sacred. "Each day the throne remains empty, our influence grows. Soon, we will not need to hide in shadows and whispers. Soon, we will stand in the full light of day, and the faithful will bow down to us, believing we are their holy shepherds." The figures began to advance, and Cardinal Torretti found himself backing toward the altar. But as his hand touched the consecrated marble, he felt a sudden warmth, not from the stone, but from the small golden cross he wore around his neck, a relic given to him by his predecessor. The cross began to glow with soft, pure light, and the advancing shadows recoiled with hisses of rage and pain. "You cannot hold us back forever," the central figure snarled. "The seal weakens with each passing hour. Soon, not even your relics will have power over us." But Cardinal Toretti had found his courage again. Then there's only one solution, isn't there? The next morning, the sixth day of the conclave, Cardinal Toretti called for an immediate vote. He stood before his fellow cardinals, many of whom looked haggard and haunted after another night of supernatural visitations, and spoke with absolute authority. Brothers, we face a crisis that transcends politics and preference. The papal throne must not remain vacant another day. I call for a unanimous vote for Cardinal Albino Luciani. But, Alessandro, Cardinal Bonetti protested, we've been deadlocked for days. What makes you think? Because, Cardinal Toretti interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, if we do not elect a pope today, there may not be a church left to govern tomorrow. The vote was indeed unanimous. Cardinal Luciani, a humble man from Venice, known for his gentle demeanor and ready smile, accepted the papacy with characteristic humility. He chose the name John Paul I, honoring his two immediate predecessors. As the white smoke finally rose from the Sistine Chapel and the bells of St. Peter's rang out across Rome, Cardinal Toretti felt the oppressive presence that had plagued the Vatican begin to recede. The shadows returned to their natural patterns, and the whispers faded to silence. But 33 days later, Pope John Paul I was found dead in his papal chambers. The official cause was given as myocardial infarction, but Cardinal Toretti, who was among the first to see the body, would never forget the expression of absolute terror frozen on the gentle pontiff's face here, the strange, claw-like marks around his throat that were carefully omitted from all official reports. The Church elected a new pope within days, Cardinal Karol Wojtyła of Poland, who took the name John Paul II. This pope would live for 26 years and become one of the most influential leaders in church history. But Cardinal Toretti, who served faithfully until his own death in 1995, never forgot the lesson he learned during those terrible days in October 1978. The papal office is indeed more than earthly authority. It is a sacred trust, a barrier against forces that existed before Christ walked among humanity and that wait still in the spaces between light and shadow, between faith and doubt, between the living and the dead. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind howls through the ancient stones of Vatican City, those who know where to listen can still hear whispers in the darkness, patient, hungry whispers that count the days until the throne of St. Peter might stand empty once again. We are still here, they seem to say. We are always here, and we are waiting. The Vatican secret archives contain many documents that will never see the light of day, sealed away not just for political reasons, but because some truths are too terrible for the faithful to bear. Cardinal Toretti's complete account of those October nights remains locked away in a vault beneath St. Peter's Basilica, along with similar reports from other times of papal transition, because the Church has learned through centuries of bitter experience that there are some hungers that can never be truly satisfied, only held at bay by faith, vigilance, and the divine authority invested in those brave enough to bear the weight of the papal crown. And in the deepest vaults of Vatican City, where even cardinals fear to tread, something stirs in the darkness each time a pope dies, testing the strength of ancient seals and waiting for its chance to finally emerge into the light of day.